The air in the courtroom hung thick and oppressive, a suffocating silence broken only by the sharp, venomous voice of the officer as it sliced through the stillness like a blade. "You think you're somebody, don't you?" he sneered, his words dripping with scorn and a bitter edge of mockery that seemed to echo off the polished wooden walls. He loomed over her, his broad frame casting a shadow that swallowed the faint light filtering through the high windows. In his meaty hand, he clutched a pair of clippers, the metal glinting ominously under the fluorescent glow, and his face twisted into a grotesque smirk, a portrait of unchecked arrogance and cruelty. He didn't just hold power in that moment, he wielded it like a weapon, savoring the weight of it as he stood over his prey. The woman knelt before him, forced down by a rough yank of her hair that sent a jolt of pain through her scalp, her thick, dark locks since a crown of pride were now a leash in his grip. The onlookers, a scattering of wide-eyed spectators seated on the hard benches, let out a ripple of uneasy murmurs, their voices low and trembling. Fear painted their faces, their knuckles whitening as they gripped the edges of their seats. But not one soul dared to rise, not the elderly man in the back row, his hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses, not the young woman in a faded blue dress, her lips parted in silent horror, not even the bailiff by the door, whose eyes darted nervously between the scene and the floor. They were all prisoners of the moment, bound by the unspoken terror of what might happen if they challenged him. But the woman at the center of this storm didn't crumble. She didn't flinch under the weight of his malice or shrink beneath the sting of his words. Her knees pressed hard against the cold, unforgiving tiles, yet her chin remained lifted, her posture unbroken. Her face was a mask of stillness, unreadable to those who didn't know where to look. But her eyes burned with a quiet, unshakable defiance. They locked onto his, twin beacons of resolve that pierced through his bravado. And that defiance only stoked his rage further. His fingers tightened around her hair, pulling harder as if he could wrench her spirit out along with it. "You people," he spat, the words oozing with contempt as he shook his head, his lip curling in disgust. To him, she was less than human, a thing to be broken, a symbol of everything he despised. "Always strutting in here like you own the place, like you're one of us, like you're equal." His voice rose, a bitter sermon delivered to the silent crowd. "Let me set you straighter. In my courtroom, I'm the law. I decide who gets to stand tall, and criminals like you don't get that privilege." With a flick of his wrist, the clippers roared to life, their mechanical buzz filling the room like a swarm of angry wasps. The sound was deafening, a cruel prelude to the act that followed. The first strands of her hair hit the floor, dark and heavy against the pale tiles, and a collective gasp tore through the spectators. It was unbearable, not just the sight, but the weight of the humiliation, the raw brutality of it. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that rolled out of him as he dragged the blades across her scalp with ruthless precision. "You should be thanking me," he taunted, his eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. "I'm doing you a favor. Now everyone will see you for what you really are, a nobody, a nothing." The clippers whirred on, stripping her bare, each pass a deliberate attempt to erase her dignity, to mark her with shame for all to witness. The courtroom was a tableau of frozen horror. Some turned away, their shoulders hunching as if they could shield themselves from the cruelty unfolding before them. The elderly man in the back pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The young woman in the blue dress clutched her purse tighter, her breath hitching as she stared at the growing pile of hair on the floor. A middle-aged attorney near the front shifted uncomfortably, his tie suddenly too tight around his throat, his pen hovering over an untouched legal pad. The jury foreman, a burly man with a weathered face, clenched his jaw so hard it twitched, his hands balled into fists on his lap. Even the court clerk, a weary figure hunched over his desk, paused mid-sentence, his pen trembling as he glanced up, the ink smudging beneath his unsteady grip. They saw it all, degradation, the powerlessness, yet they remained rooted, silent witnesses to an injustice they couldn't summon the courage to stop. She, however, sat still as stone. Her head was bare now, her scalp exposed to the cool air, her dignity laid out like an offering on the altar of his cruelty. But her face didn't falter. No tears streaked her cheeks, no desperate pleas escaped her lips, no tremble betrayed her resolve. She was silent, But it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was something deeper. Something that hummed beneath the surface quiet so profound it felt like the calm before a storm. And then when the last strand fell, when he'd carved his mark of disgrace into her flesh, he grabbed her chin, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Now," he muttered, his voice low and thick with smug satisfaction. "Now you look like what you really are." For a single heartbeat, the room held its breath, and then she smiled. Not a smirk born of bitterness, not a fractured mask to hide her pain, but a real smile, steady and laced with a knowing that sent a shiver through the air. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong in this moment, the kind that turned the script upside down. The officer's smirk faltered, a flicker of unease darting across his features. He'd expected her to break, to crumble into a heap of rage or despair. But this was something he couldn't grasp. Her smile was a mirror, reflecting his own fragility back at him, and for the first time that day, he felt the ground shift beneath his boots. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade of its own calm. Measured and unshaken, he blinked, caught off guard. "What?" he stammered, his grip on her chin loosening as confusion crept into his sneer. "I asked if you're finished," she repeated, tilting her head slightly, her tone as steady as a heartbeat. "Because if you are, I'd like to get back to my courtroom." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stunned chamber. A chilling stillness spread, thick and heavy, as the meaning sank in. His hand fell away entirely now, and she rose to her feet with a grace that belied the brutality she'd endured. She brushed off her clothes, the gesture casual yet deliberate, as if shaking off dust from a long journey. The weight of his act slid off her like water off glass. Powerless against the strength she carried within, she met his gaze again, her eyes sharp and unrelenting, and stepped past him. "You heard me," she said, her voice clear and firm. "You just assaulted the presiding judge of this court." The officer's face drained of color, his bravado evaporating as the air grew thick with the gasps of the crowd. The elderly man in the back whispered, "No way," his voice trembling with disbelief. The young woman in the blue dress clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The bailiff by the door stiffened, his hand hovering near his belt as if unsure what to do next. The attorney dropped his pen, the clatter echoing in the silence, while the jury foreman let out a low, shaky breath. The clerk's head snapped up, his glasses slipping down his nose as realization dawned, his fingers tightening around his smudged papers. She reached for the black robe draped over the judge's chair, her movements slow and deliberate, each step a reclaiming of the authority he'd tried to strip away. She pulled it over her shoulders, fastening it with steady hands, and as the fabric settled around her, the room felt the full weight of who she was. The officer stumbled back, his voice cracking as he stammered, "That's not this isn't," but she turned to face him, her presence no longer just a quiet defiance, but a towering force of justice, unyielding and absolute. "You wanted to prove I was beneath you," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong, filling every corner of the silent room. "You wanted to humiliate me, to strip me of my dignity, to show everyone here that I'm nothing." She took a slow step toward him, her gaze never wavering. "But tell me, officer, how does it feel now?" He couldn't answer. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his eyes darting to the crowd, to the guards, to anyone who might save him from the hole he'd dug. But no one moved. The guards stood rigid, their faces unreadable. The attorney exchanged a glance with his colleague, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power. The jury foreman swallowed hard, his fists unclenching as Al replaced his tension. The clerk's pen hovered, forgotten, as he stared at the woman who'd just turned the tables on her tormentor. And then the doors burst open. A flood of black uniformed figures stormed in, their boots pounding the tiles with swift, precise rhythm. Their faces were stern, their movements a blur of efficiency, and the officer's breath hitched as he stumbled back again. Wait, hold on a second," he pleaded, but it was too late. Handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound sharp and final. The man who'd stood moments ago dripping with arrogance, who'd wielded his power like a tyrant, was now a prisoner in the very room he thought he ruled. His hands were wrenched behind his back, his protests fading into a pitiful whimper as they dragged him toward the exit. The last thing he saw was her standing tall, unshaken. Her robe a mantle of authority no blade could cut, no cruelty could diminish. She was a force no man could break, her quiet power a testament to the justice she embodied. What happened next sent shockwaves beyond those walls. The story spread like wildfire, igniting headlines and shaking the nation to its core. History was written that day, not just in the fall of a man who thought himself untouchable, but in the rise of a woman who proved that true power lies not in force, but in resilience. For the officer, the consequences were brutal, a reckoning for the arrogance that had blinded him. Justice didn't just prevail, it roared, a reminder that those who abuse power will face its weight in return. And for her, Judge Naomi Carter, it was a moment that etched her name into the annals of courage, a legacy forged in the fire of adversity, a beacon for all who'd been told they were nothing. The courtroom, once a stage for his cruelty, became a monument to her strength, and the lesson lingered long after the echoes faded. Power misused is power lost, and justice, when it comes, spares no one. In the heart of the city, where the scales of justice tipped precariously between order and chaos, the law was more than just a set of rules, it was a living force, a double-edged sword capable of cutting through corruption or shielding the vulnerable from tyranny. For Naomi Carter, it had become her life's mission, a beacon she'd chased through the grueling years of law school, where sleep was a distant memory and doubt was a constant companion. She'd endured the late nights hunched over textbooks, her eyes burning from exhaustion, her mind racing to keep up with an unrelenting curriculum. She'd weathered the sit-along glances of classmates, some subtle, some overtwo whispered behind her back that she didn't belong, that her presence was a fluke in their pristine, privileged world. But Naomi had clawed her way forward, fueled by a fire that refused to flicker out, a determination to prove not just to them, but to herself, that she was meant to be there. Every exam aced, every argument won, every sleepless night survived had been a brick laid in the foundation of her resolve. By the time she donned the black robes of a judge, she'd earned her place 1,000 times over. Yet, even as she ascended to the bench, the whispers didn't stop. They morphed into something uglier, more insidious. Diversity higher, they hissed in the corridors, their voices low but venomous, as if her appointment was a political chess move, rather than the culmination of decades of sacrifice. They didn't see the young girl who'd stayed up under a dim lamp in a cramped apartment, dreaming of a courtroom where her voice could matter. They didn't see the woman who'd turned down invitations to parties, to dates, to anything that might pull her focus from the path she'd carved for herself. They didn't see the battles she'd fought against prejudice, against exhaustion, against the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, they were right. But Naomi carried herself with a quiet, unshakable confidence, not because she had nothing left to prove, but because she'd already proven everything she needed to herself. The courtroom became her sanctuary, her kingdom, a space where her gavel fell like thunder, where her rulings reshaped lives with the weight of finality. She sent criminals to prison with a steady hand, overturned convictions that reeked of injustice, and stared down the powerful politicians, tycoons, law enforcement who thought their influence could sway her. She was a guardian of fairness, a sentinel against abuse, and she wielded the law with a precision that left no room for compromise. Of course, not everyone welcomed her reign. Resistance shadowed her every decision. There were Manawi's men who bristled at the sight of her, a black woman perched above them, her voice calm but unyielding as she dismantled their arguments. Police officers grumbled when her rulings clipped their wings. Prosecutors sneered when she questioned their tactics, their egos wounded by her refusal to bend. But Naomi never flinched. She'd faced worse than their disdain. She'd built her life on overcoming it. Each glare, each muttered insult only sharpened her resolve. She wasn't here to be liked, she was here to be just, and she had no intention of softening her edges now. Among her adversaries, none loomed larger than Officer Bradley Kingston. He was a man carved from the city's underbelly, a towering figure whose broad shoulders and square jaw gave him the look of a statue, forged in intimidation. His eyes, cold and piercing, flickered with a calculating menace that made people shrink in his presence. For 15 years, he'd thrived in the shadows of a system where fear was currency and power was law at least. His version of it, Kingston didn't just enforce order, he imposed it. His badge a license to bend the world to his will. To him, he was the city's backbone, the arbiter of who walked free and who paid in blood. His reputation on the force wasn't built on paperwork or protocol, it was forged in the bruises he left behind, in the stories that drifted through the precinct like smoke. Young black men hauled into his station emerged with swollen faces and broken spirits, their complaints vanishing into thin air. Women stopped on flimsy pretexts found themselves pinned against walls, searched with hands that lingered too long, their dignity discarded like trash. Defense attorneys swapped tales of his brutality over late-night drinks, but those stories never reached a courtroom. Complaints filed against him dissolved like mist, swallowed by a network of loyal friends and high-place cops, clerks. Even a few judges swore ensured his record stayed clean. Kingston knew the game, knew how to twist the rules until they snapped, and he wore his invincibility like armor. As long as that badge gleamed on his chest, he believed no one could touch him. But there was one person who pierced that armor, one name that set his teeth on edge: Judge Naomi Carter. She was his nemesis, a thorn in his side that refused to be plucked. Time and again, she'd humiliated him, her voice cutting through his carefully constructed cases like a blade. She'd tossed out evidence he'd fabricated, her sharp eyes catching the inconsistencies he thought he'd buried. She'd called him out in open court, her words measured but merciless, dismantling his unconstitutional searches and exposing his lies for all to see. Each time she overruled him, each time she forced him to stand there, powerless. As she stripped away his authority, he felt something slip a crack in the foundation of his dominance. It wasn't just about the cases she ruined, it was about what she stood for. A black woman, sitting in judgment over him, telling him what he could and couldn't do. It was an affront he couldn't stomach. The thought gnawed at him, day after day, as he watched her behind that bench, her head held high, her rulings delivered with an authority he'd never possess. She was a threat, a symbol of everything he despised, and he wanted nothing more than to shatter her, to drag her down to the dirt where he thought she belonged. He'd spent months stewing in that rage, waiting for a chance to strike, to remind her who really ruled that courthouse. And today, fate had handed him the perfect opening. It started like any other morning. Naomi swept into the courtroom, her robes flowing behind her, her presence commanding the space as it always did. The case on the docket was routine, a hearing for a man accused of resisting arrest, a charge pinned on him by none other than Officer Kingston. She'd seen this script before, flimsy evidence, a story that didn't add up, a defendant too scared to fight back. She settled into her routine, her mind already sifting through the details when something shifted. Kingston was there, standing near the prosecution's table, his posture too stiff, his gaze too fixed. She felt it before she saw it, a heaviness in the air, a prickling unease that made her pause as she approached the bench. His eyes followed her, unblinking, and for a moment, she wondered what storm was brewing behind them. Then he stepped forward, his boots thudding against the polished floor, and his voice broke the silence like a gunshot. "You," he said, the word dripping with a malice she couldn't quite name. It hung there, sharp and jagged, as she turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "Excuse me," she replied, her tone cool, steady, a shield against whatever he was hurling her way. "You think you can waltz in here like you own this place?" His voice rose, each syllable laced with venom, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you can strut around, acting like you're above us all?" The room tilted, heads turned, murmurs rippled through the gallery like a rising tide. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Naomi held her ground, her heart thudding but her face a mask of calm. "I don't know what you're talking about, Officer Kingston. If there's an issue." "The issue," he snapped, cutting her off, stepping closer until she could feel the heat of his anger, "is that people like you don't get to make the rules. You don't get to prance around here pretending you're better than us." Before she could process the words, before she could summon a response, he lunged. His hand shot out, seizing her arm with a grip that made her breath hitch. Gasps erupted around them, a chorus of shock reverberating off the walls. "Officer Kingston!" An attorney shouted, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Let go of her," another cried, but the pleas fell on deaf ears. Kingston yanked her forward, his fingers digging into her flesh, and then she felt it cold. metallic hum of clippers buzzing to life. Her stomach dropped as he grabbed a fistful of her hair, wrenching her head back just enough to expose her scalp. The first pass of the blades was a violation so raw, so visceral, that time seemed to slow. Strands of her hair dark, thick, a crown she'd worn with pride tumbled to the floor. The sound of their fall drowned out by the screams of onlookers. "You want to talk about power?" he sneered, his breath hot against her ear as he dragged the clippers again, stripping away another piece of her. "This is power." The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Clerks froze, their hands hovering over phones, unsure whether to call for help. Attorneys stumbled over each other, shouting protests that tangled into a useless cacophony. The jury sat wide-eyed, their faces pale with horror, while the guards at the door exchanged frantic glances, paralyzed by the surreal brutality unfolding before them. Naomi felt every second of its sting of the blades, the weight of a dozen eyes watching her humiliation, the laughter spilling from Kingston's lips like poison. "You should thank me," he taunted, his voice thick with triumph as he tossed the clippers aside, letting the last of her hair drift to the ground. "Now everyone can see what you really are." The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy shroud that smothered the room. The remnants of her hair lay scattered across the floor, a dark constellation against the cold tile. Naomi stood there, exposed, her scalp prickling in the air, her dignity torn away in front of a crowd too stunned to act. But she didn't crumble. She didn't reach for her head or shrink into herself. Instead, she straightened, her spine a steel rod, and lifted her gaze to meet Kingston's. Her eyes burned with something fierce, something unbroken, and then slowly, deliberately smiled. It was a small, steady curve of her lips, laced with a danger he couldn't fathom. Because in that moment, Officer Bradley Kingston had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The tension crackled like lightning waiting to strike. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with unspoken fury. Kingston stepped back, his chest heaving, a smirk still plastered across his face as he admired his handiwork. "There," he muttered, tossing a dismissive glance at the clippers now resting on her bench. "That's better. Now you look like the criminals you've been coddling all this time." His words were a match thrown into dry grass, and the room ignited. Horror morphed into rage, fear into defiance. A senior attorney, a weary man in a gray suit named Daniel Hargrove, pushed through the chaos, his face drained of color, but his voice sharp as a blade. "Officer Kingston, have you lost your damn mind? Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Kingston wheeled on him, his smirk widening. "I did what should have been done years ago. She's been playing queen up there, letting scum walk free, questioning me, my department, every chance she gets. Not anymore. Today, she learned her place." But the murmur that rose in response wasn't one of agreement, it was a low, dangerous hum, a collective awakening. Naomi remained still, her silence louder than any shout, letting the weight of Kingston's actions settle over the room like a storm cloud. She could feel a shift in the air, the turning of the tide. Hargrove, trembling with fury, took another step forward, his finger jabbing toward Kingston. "You think this is power? You think this makes you untouchable? You've just signed your own ruin." Kingston laughed, a harsh, grating sound, but it faltered as he glanced around. The guards were moving now, their hesitation giving way to purpose. The clerks whispered into phones, their voices urgent, the jury's faces hardened, their shock replaced by a resolve that mirrored Naomi's own. And in the back of the room, a young court reporter named Leela, who'd watched Naomi with quiet admiration for months, clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she vowed to make sure this moment was never forgotten. Naomi's smile widened, just a fraction, as she locked eyes with Kingston one last time. He'd wanted to break her, to strip her down to nothing. But he didn't understand the lesson she'd learned long ago, that justice wasn't just a shield. It was a weapon, too, one she'd honed through every trial, every insult, every victory. He'd abused his power, wielded it like a club to crush her, but in doing so, he'd handed her the means to dismantle him. The law would turn on him now, its consequences unrelenting, and she would be there, steady and unbowed, to see it through. Because if there was one truth Naomi Carter knew above all else, it was this: those who twisted justice for their own gain would always, inevitably, face its reckoning. The courtroom air hung heavy, thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface. Polished wooden benches, the high ceiling, the faded American flag drooping in the corner. It was a space meant for order, for justice, but now it trembled on the edge of chaos. The court clerk, a weary man with thinning gray hair and a perpetually nervous twitch, stood frozen behind his desk. His hand, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm, hovered over the phone on his desk. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the dim fluorescent light as he hesitated, torn between duty and the fear that had rooted him to the spot. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment of indecision would shift the course of everything. Across the room, Officer Bradley Kingston loomed like a thunder cloud ready to burst. His broad shoulders filled out his crisp police uniform, the badge pinned to his chest glinting with an arrogance he'd worn for years. His face, weathered by time and hardened by unchecked power, darkened as he caught sight of the clerk's trembling hand. His eyes narrowed into slits, a predator sizing up its prey. "Put that down," he growled, his voice low and menacing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. The clerk flinched, his fingers twitching toward the phone. But he wasn't fast enough, not nearly fast enough for Kingston's liking. In 3 strides, the officer stormed across the room, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor, each step reverberating with a fury that made the onlookers shrink back. He snatched the phone from the clerk's grasp with a violence that sent a shudder through the room, and smashed it onto the desk. The crack of plastic against wood echoed, sharp and jarring, making everyone jump. Papers scattered. A pen rolled to the floor, and the clerk stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panic gasps. "No one calls anyone until I say so," Kingston barked, his voice booming, filling every corner of the courtroom. His chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment, he stood there, towering over the trembling clerk, reveling in the fear he'd ignited. It was his second mistake that day, though he couldn't see it yet. The first had been assuming this room, this sacred space of law, belonged to him. The second was believing he could bend it to his will without consequence. The guards stationed by the double doors, 2 burly men in faded uniforms who had been slouching moments before, snapped to attention, their spines straightened, their hands hovering near their belts as if suddenly remembering the weight of their own authority. Across the room, the attorneys, 3 of them, sharp-eyed and dressed in pressed suits, exchanged fleeting glances. No words passed between them, but their eyes spoke volumes, a silent pact forming in the air, a shared understanding that Kingston had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The courtroom wasn't his playground, and he wasn't its king. His power, the kind he'd wielded like a club for years, was unraveling before their eyes, and the realization crept across his faces, slow, suffocating, undeniable. Naomi Carter, the judge presiding over this crumbling scene, stood at the center of it all. She'd been silent until now, her presence a quiet force amid the storm. Her robes hung around her like a mantle of authority, the black fabric stark against her poised frame. She exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to steady the air itself, and took a single step forward. The click of her heel against the floor rang out, sharp and piercing in the oppressive silence, a sound that seemed to demand the room's attention. Every head turned toward her, every pair of eyes waiting. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone, carrying a calm that hid something lethal beneath its surface like a river concealing jagged rocks. "Today, someone is learning their place." Kingston's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his stubbled skin. For a fraction of a second, his bravado flickered a crack in the armor he'd built over decades. He squared his shoulders, forcing himself back into the role he knew so well. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped, his voice rough with defiance as he tried to claw back control. "No one's going to stand up for you, not against me. You think those cops outside are gonna barge in here and arrest me? You think the system's gonna pick you over me?" He let out a harsh, barking laugh, short and bitter, shaking his head as if she were a child spouting nonsense. "You're delusional." Naomi didn't flinch. She studied him, her dark eyes steady and unyielding, taking in every twitch of his face, every falter in his stance. After a long, heavy moment, She tilted her head just slightly, a gesture so subtle, yet so commanding it seemed to shift the air around her. "Tell me, Officer Kingston," she said, her tone dangerously even, each word deliberate and weighted. "Do you know what happens when a police officer assaults a sitting judge in their own courtroom?" His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a faint hitch of breath as his mind scrambled for a response. She didn't wait for one. "Do you know what happens when there are dozens of witnesses?" she pressed, her voice gaining momentum, smooth and unrelenting. She let her gaze sweep the room, slow and deliberate, watching as understanding dawned on the faces around her, with clerks' wide-eyed shock, the guards' tightening grips, the attorneys' subtle nods. When there are security cameras recording every second of it, when every single person in this room just became part of something that'll be plastered across every news channel in the country before the sun sets. Kingston's breathing faltered, his chest rising and falling unevenly. His hands, still clenched at his sides, trembled faintly, not from anger now, but from something deeper, something he couldn't name yet. Naomi took another step closer, her presence filling the space between them, her voice dropping to a near whisper, intimate yet merciless. "And do you know what happens when the judge you assault hath one you tried to break as the power to ensure that justice isn't just a word, but a reckoning?" She let the question hang there, heavy and unanswerable, watching as it sank into him like a stone. For the first time, Kingston looked uncertain. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an anchor, a lifeline, but the faces staring back offered none. The clerk, still clutching the edge of his desk, swallowed hard, his knuckles white. The guards shifted their weight, their expressions unreadable but their postures rigid with purpose. The attorneys leaned forward slightly, their pens stilled, their breaths held. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting. Kingston's lips parted again, defiance flaring one last time. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice cracking at the edges. "You think?" The double doors burst open with a force that rattled the hinges, cutting him off mid-sentence. Two uniformed officers strode in, their steps purposeful, their faces carved from stone. These weren't Kingston's men, not the ones who snapped to his orders, not the ones who'd turned a blind eye to his excesses. These were outsiders, internal affairs, their insignia gleaming under the courtroom lights. They moved with a quiet, unshakable authority, their eyes sweeping the scene-taking and the shattered phone, the trembling clerk, the judge standing tall, and Kingston, wild-eyed and teetering on the edge. The room held its breath as one of them, a tall man with a jaw like granite, turned to Naomi. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice crisp and formal, cutting through the haze. "Are you all right?" Her lips curved into a smile, not the warm, patient one she'd worn in quieter days, nor the knowing one she'd aimed at Kingston earlier. This one was different, sharp, cold, a blade wrapped in velvet. "I am now," she replied, her tone carrying a finality that seemed to echo off the walls. She turned back to Kingston, her expression unreadable yet piercing, as if she could see straight through him, through his bluster, his badge, his crumbling empire. "Officer Kingston," she said, her voice rising to fill the room, steady and resolute. "You are hereby under arrest." The words landed like a thunderclap, and in that instant, everything Kingston had built came crashing down. His bravado shattered, his confidence fractured, his power thing he'd clutched so tightly, the thing he'd believed made him untouchable, slipped through his fingers like sand. "No," he muttered, shaking his head as if he could will it away. "No, you can't," but they could. And they did. The officers closed in, their movements swift and practiced. For the first time in his career, Kingston stumbled back, his boots scuffing the floor, his hands jerking instinctively as if to fend them off. Wait, just let's talk about this," he pleaded, his voice rising, frantic and ragged, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He searched for a savior, a friend. Samyoni and Yodo pulled him back from the abyss, but the faces staring back were stone cold, unmoved. The clerk averted his gaze, clutching his desk like a lifeline. The guards stood silent, their hands resting on their belts. The attorneys watched with detached curiosity, as if observing a specimen under glass. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists cut through the air, a sound sharper than any gavel, heavier than any sentence. His breath hitched, his chest heaving as panic clawed its way up his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed, instinct screaming at him to fight, to resist, to reclaim the control that had always been his. But there was nothing left to reclaim. The badge on his chest, the uniform he'd worn like a second skin, the authority he'd draped around himself like a cloak, it all meant nothing now. The officers flanking him weren't his allies, they were internal affairs. Men who answered to a higher code. Men who saw through the shield he'd hid behind for years. He knew what their presence meant. Investigations, inquiries, a dismantling of everything he'd built. His throat tightened, his pulse hammering in his ears as the reality sank in. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, his voice low and thick, a desperate edge bleeding through. He forced a laugh, sharp and hollow, shaking his head as if he could convince himself this was a nightmare he'd wake from. "You think this is gonna stick? You think I don't have people?" His jaw clenched, his words more for himself now, a lifeline to the illusion he'd lived in for so long. But the taller officer tightened his grip on Kingston's arm, his dark eyes meeting Kingston's with a calm, unyielding stare. "You had people," he said, his voice flat, devoid of malice or triumph, just a simple, cutting truth. "Not anymore." The words hit like a punch, stripping away the last of Kingston's defiance. His mouth opened, ready to argue, to threaten, to claw his way back, but before he could, Naomi stepped forward again. She'd been silent as the officers moved in, watching with a stillness that seemed to hold the room together. Now, she was a force unleashed, her presence commanding every inch of the space. Her eyes locked onto Kingston's, and in them, he saw not just victory, but something far worse, certainty. "This isn't just about you losing your badge," she said, her voice quiet yet piercing, each word a nail in the coffin of his world. "This is about justice, serial justice. The kind you can't bully or bribe your way out of. The kind that doesn't bend to men like you." They dragged him forward, his boots scuffing the floor, his protests growing louder, more desperate. "You can't do this. You don't know who I am," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. But it was a hollow sound, stripped of its former weight. Naomi didn't look away as they pulled him toward the doors, not as his breathing quickened, not as the reality of his fall settled into his bones. She stood there, unwavering, a pillar of strength amid the wreckage he'd left behind. Because this wasn't just about an arrest, or even about consequences. This was about power, the kind Kingston had abused, the kind he'd mistaken for invincibility. He'd thought he could break her, that his badge and his bluster would shield him from the fallout. But true power didn't come from a uniform or a title. It came from integrity, from the courage to stand when others faltered. That power belonged to Naomi, and as Kingston was hauled away, he was only beginning to grasp how badly he'd misjudged her, and how steep the price of that mistake would be. His badge was gone, his freedom slipping away. But the worst was still to come, the unraveling of his name, his life, everything he'd clung to. Justice, cold and unyielding, had found him at last, and it wouldn't let go. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface, every breath. She stood there, Naomi Carter, motionless as a statue carved from marble, her presence commanding silence without a single raised word or furious gesture. She hadn't screamed for retribution, hadn't hurled venomous accusations, hadn't let her voice crack with the fury that surely simmered beneath her composed exterior. Instead, she waited, patient, resolute, her stillness more piercing than any outburst could have been. The deliberate tap of her heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the room. As she drew closer, each step a slow, measured drumbeat that reverberated in Bradley Kingston's chest. It wasn't fear, he told himself, not yet, just an unfamiliar itch crawling beneath his skin. A sensation he couldn't name but couldn't shake. "You're scared," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the silence like a whisper of wind across a frozen lake. Simple, direct, undeniable. Kingston's body betrayed him before his mind could catch up. His shoulders squared, his spine stiffened, pride surging like a reflex to shield him from the truth. His stomach churned, a tight knot of unease twisting deeper. But he forced his face into a mask of defiance. "I'm not," he shot back, the words sharp and brittle, clinging to the edges of a confidence that was slipping through his fingers like sand. Naomi tilted her head, just slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his with a calm certainty that made his pulse stutter. "You are," she replied, her tone unshaken, almost serene, as if she were stating the weather or the time of day. "You're scared because, for once, you don't know what's coming. For the first time in your miserable, power-drunk life, the script isn't yours to write." Her words carried no venom, no jagged edge of spite or triumph. They were worse—they were plain, unadorned truth, delivered with the quiet weight of someone who had already seen the ending. Kingston's breath hitched, his mind scrambling to reclaim control, to find footing on the crumbling ledge of his authority. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped, forcing his voice into something steadier, something that sounded like the man he'd always been, one who bent the world to his will. He jerked his head toward the internal affairs officers standing nearby, his wrists straining against the cold bite of the handcuffs. "You think these clowns are your allies? That they give a damn about you or some noble idea of justice? They're just hunting a trophy. Naomi, once they're done carving me up, they'll toss me aside and move on to the next poor bastard. You're nothing special, just a tool in their game." His lips twisted into a smirk, though it felt thinner now, less anchored, a fragile shield against the dread pooling in his gut. For a long, suffocating moment, Naomi said nothing. She simply watched him, her expression an unreadable mask, her gaze steady and unrelenting. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, until finally her lips parted, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow filled the room. "Tell me, Officer Kingston," she began, each word deliberate, dripping with intent. "Do you know what happens when a police officer assaults a sitting judge? In the middle of their own courtroom." His breath stalled, caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. He opened his mouth to respond, to deflect, but nothing came. His voice had abandoned him. She pressed on, unhurried, her tone as calm as a still sea hiding a storm. "Do you know what happens when there are dozens of ordinary people, court clerks, lawyers still watching in stunned silence? When security cameras catch every second of it, every swing of your fist, every snarl on your face?" Her eyes swept the room, taking in the scattered figuresque bailiff frozen by the door, the stenographer clutching her notepad, the officers standing like sentinels. She let the reality settle, let it sink into Kingston's bones like damp rot. "And do you know," she continued, her voice softening now, almost tender in its certainty, "what happens when every single person in this room becomes part of a story that will blaze across every news channel in the country before the sun sets tonight?" His stomach plummeted, a sickening drop that left him hollow. "Or what happens when the judge you attack had when you tried to break, to humiliate, holds the power to ensure that justice isn't just a word, but a reckoning?" The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed every sound, every thought. For the first time in his life, Bradley Kingston felt small, shrunken, insignificant, stripped bare under the weight of her gaze. Then, with a nod so subtle it might have been missed, Naomi turned to the officers. "Take him," she said, her voice steady, final. Kingston lurched forward, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, a primal instinct to fight, to claw his way back from the edge. "Wait," he barked, his voice cracking, raw and desperate as his feet stumbled beneath him. The officers gripped his arms, their hands firm, unyielding, pulling him toward the door. "I have rights. I'm an officer of the law." Naomi's eyes met his, unflinching, a quiet storm brewing in their depths. "Not anymore," she said, and with those three words, something inside him shattered at his pride, his certainty, his world. The courtroom doors swung open with a groan, and a rush of frigid air slammed into him as they dragged him into the hallway. That was when he saw them, the swarm of reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning, their voices a chaotic hum of questions and shouts. Beyond them stood officials, onlookers, and worst of all, his fellow officers, the men he'd called brothers, the ones he'd laughed with over beers, the ones he'd trusted to have his back. They stood motionless, their faces blank, their eyes averted or cold. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the wild whip of his head as he searched their expressions for something, anything flicker of loyalty, a hint they'd step in. But there was nothing. Panic clawed at his chest, sharp and unrelenting. They weren't moving. They weren't helping. They were letting him fall. The police car door slammed shut behind him, the sound of brutal punctuation to his unraveling. The noise of the crowd, the shouts, the camera clicks got off abruptly, replaced by the stifling quiet of the vehicle's interior. His breaths came in jagged, uneven gasps, his chest heaving as if the air itself refused to fill his lungs. His mind screamed, a torrent of denial and disbelief, but his lips stayed sealed, no words brave enough to escape. Through the thick, bulletproof glass, he caught sight of her, Naomi Carter, standing poised on the courthouse steps. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't even smile. She just watched, her silhouette framed against the gray sky, a figure of unshakable resolve. And in that moment, as the car jolted forward and the weight of his collapse pressed him into the cold seat, Kingston understood. This wasn't just an arrest, this was his end. Naomi had won, and he had lost everything: his badge, his power, his identity. The patrol car rumbled down the street, its tires rolling over the uneven asphalt with a steady, monotonous hum that filled the confined space. Outside, the world blurred past in streaks of neon signs and the faint glow of streetlights. But Kingston's eyes barely registered it. His hands, bound tight behind his back, ached where the handcuffs bit into his wrists, the metal an unyielding reminder of his new reality. Once, those hands had wielded authority without questions, lambing suspects against walls, signing off on reports that twisted the truth, resting casually on the grip of his service weapon. Now, they were powerless, trembling faintly with a mix of rage and helplessness he couldn't suppress. His mind raced, a frantic whirlwind of half-formed plans and desperate excuses. He'd always been the one to talk his way out, to spin a story so tight it left no room for doubt. He'd walked away from worship bar fights covered up, complaints buried, witnesses persuaded to forget what they'd seen. But this was a wall of evidence he couldn't charm or bully his way through. Dozens of eyes had watched him lunge at Naomi, a sitting judge, in the heart of her own courtroom. Cameras had captured it all: fury in his snarl, the arc of his fist, the chaos that followed. His arrogance had been his undoing, convincing him he could act with impunity, just as he always had. Now, that same arrogance mocked him, a bitter echo in the silence. The two officers in the front seat sat like statues, their presence a quiet condemnation. The woman in the passenger seat, her sharp features illuminated by the dashboard lights, glanced back at him through the rearview mirror every few minutes. Her eyes were cold, assessing, stripping him bare with every look. He felt her judgment like a blade against his throat. No pity, no hesitation, just the steady gaze of someone watching a man crumble. The driver, a broad-shouldered veteran with a face weathered by years on the job, kept his focus on the road, but his silence spoke louder than words. Kingston's jaw clenched, his pride flaring one last time, a dying ember refusing to fade. "This is bullshit," he muttered, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet. "You people don't even know what you're doing. You're letting a room full of spineless nobodies decide my fate instead of backing one of your own." The driver let out a sound, a low, dry scoff that wasn't quite a laugh, but something harder, more final. He shook his head, just enough for Kingston to catch it in the dim light. "You still don't get it," the man said, his voice steady, worn smooth by years of seeing men like Kingston fall. "You thought that badge was a crown, not a duty. You thought it made you untouchable. Now it's gone, and you're just a guy in cuffs who doesn't know who he is without it." The words hit like a punch, raw and unsparing, and Kingston's body tensed, his nostrils flaring as anger surged through him, hot and reckless. Before he could spit back a retort, the woman turned slightly in her seat, her voice slicing through the tension like a knife through silk. "You spent years breaking people," she said, her tone flat, factual, but edged with something sharp. "You left bruises on anyone who crossed you, suspects, witnesses, even your own partners when they didn't fall in line. You built your whole career on fear, on bending the rules until they snapped." She paused, her eyes locking onto his through the mirror, a faint glimmer of amusement flickering in them. "And now, here you are, another thug in the back seat, whining about rights you never respected for anyone else." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but enough to twist the knife deeper. Kingston's jaw locked so tight he felt the strain in his teeth, his mind reeling as her words sank in. "This won't stick," he hissed. shaking his head as if he could shake off the truth. "You'll see. I'll be back. This isn't over." But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, a desperate grasp at a lifeline that wasn't there. The woman turned back to face the road, her silence louder than any reply, and the driver didn't even bother to glance at him. The car rolled on, the hum of the engine a steady pulse beneath the chaos of his thoughts. Outside, the city lights faded into the distance, and Kingston's gaze drifted to the window, catching one last glimpse of Naomi Carter on the courthouse steps. She stood alone, a solitary figure against the looming stone facade, her posture unbowed, her presence a quiet force that had toppled him without a single shout. Justice, he realized too late, wasn't loud or vengeful. It was patient, relentless, a slow tide that eroded everything in its path. He'd abused his power, wielded it like a weapon without consequence. And now the consequences had come, not with fanfare, but with the cold, unyielding grip of reality. As the car carried him away, the weight of his choices pressed down. A suffocating truth. Naomi hadn't just beaten him, she'd exposed him. And the world he'd ruled had turned its back. Bradley Kingston's voice trembled as desperation clawed its way up his throat. No matter how hard he tried to choke it down, the words spilled out, jagged and unsteady, as he clung to the fraying threads of his confidence. "I'll get out of this," he insisted, his tone sharpening with defiance. "You really think I don't have people? You think I don't have lawyers? My record." He paused, forcing the words out like they could rebuild the crumbling wall of his authority. "My record speaks for itself." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him, a quiet, insidious thing that made his chest tighten. The officer sitting beside him, a weary man with a face carved from years of cynicism, let out a laugh, short and cutting, like the snap of a whip. This time, though, it carried a harder edge, a bitterness that sliced through the air. "Your record," he repeated, his head tilting just enough to catch Kingston's eye in the dim light of the patrol car. The question hung there, heavy and mocking, before he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver racing down Kingston's spine. "You mean the one they're tearing apart right now? The one stuffed with complaints that mysteriously vanished, investigations that got buried, cases that should have landed you in hot water years ago?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, sharp and unforgiving. "That record, Kingston, it's not a shield, it's a cover-up. And guess what?" He paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt suffocating. "That cover's gone now." The words hit Kingston like a tidal wave, cold and relentless, crashing over him with such force that his stomach lurched. His breath quickened, shallow and ragged, as his heart slammed against his ribcage, each beat a frantic plea to wake up from this nightmare. The reality was sinking in. Slow and brutality weren't driving him to his precinct, where his allies could swoop in with favors and hushed deals. They weren't taking him anywhere he could pull strings or call in debts. No, the car was barreling toward Central Holding, a fortress of concrete and steel where power like his didn't mean a damn thing. His pulse spiked, a wild rhythm pounding in his ears, and his muscles seized up as if they could stop time itself. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping low, a shaky attempt to wrestle back control. "Let's talk about this." The officers didn't even glance at him. Their silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold. "You're making a mistake," he pressed, injecting authority into his tone like it could still carry weight. But the words felt hollow, echoing in the cramped space of the car. Stripped of the power he'd wielded for so long. "You take me to Central. You're opening a door you can't close. You think I don't have enemies in there?" His mind raced, conjuring images of the men he'd crossed, faces bruised and bloodied by his hands, voices silenced by his badge. He'd made enemies, plenty of them, and they'd be waiting. The IA officer beside him let out a low, dark chuckle, the sound dripping with menace. "Oh, we know," he said simply, his eyes glinting with something almost gleeful. "That's exactly why we're taking you there." Kingston's throat went dry, the air turning to sand in his lungs. The car slowed, tires crunching against gravel as it pulled into the shadow of Central Holding. The towering walls loomed ahead, gray and unyielding, their jagged edges cutting into the overcast sky like the teeth of some ancient beast. The gates clanged shut behind them with a metallic groan, and the sound reverberated through Kingston's bones, a final note in the symphony of his undoing. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a reckoning. The car jolted to a stop, and before Kingston could brace himself, the door flew open, out. The officer barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the haze of Kingston's thoughts. He didn't move an at first. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to cling to the last shred of safety inside that vehicle. The moment his feet hit the ground, he knew it was over. "I said get out." A rough hand seized his arm, yanking him from the seat with a force that made his shoulder ache. He stumbled forward, forced to face the scene unfolding before him. A crowd had gathered, officers with folded arms, inmates peering through bars, guards leaning against walls with lazy smirks. They watched him, their eyes sharp and unblinking, a gallery of judgment that pinned him in place. Whispers rippled through the air, some quiet and conspiratorial, others loud with unrestrained glee. And then he saw Marcus Lyle, standing just beyond a set of reinforced bars, his presence a thunderclap in Kingston's unraveling world. Lyle's arms were crossed over his chest, his lean frame relaxed against the metal. But his grin was anything but casual. It was slow, deliberate, a predator's smile brimming with dark promise. Kingston's stomach plummeted, a sickening drop that left him dizzy. Well, Lyle murmured, his voice smooth as oil, his eyes gleaming with a quiet, simmering rage. "Look what we have here." Kingston's breathing turned shallow, panic rising like bile in his throat, bitter and choking. Another inmate, a broad-shouldered man with a scar snaking down his cheek, let out a deep, rumbling chuckle. "Ain't this poetic?" he said, his voice thick with amusement, loud enough to draw a few nods from the others. The weight of their stares pressed down on Kingston, suffocating, relentless. 1,000 tiny blades sinking into his skin. He'd walked these halls before, countless times, his head held high, his voice a whip cracking through the air. He'd issued orders, demanded compliance, reveled in the fear he inspired. Now, as the officers shoved him toward intake, he felt the shift in the air. The predator had become the prey. Naomi Carter's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from years ago when she'd warned him. "You're scared." Back then, he'd laughed it off, dismissing her as weak, sentimental. But now, as the heavy steel doors of Central Holding slammed shut behind him, the sound ringing with a bone-chilling finality, Bradley Kingston understood fear in a way he never had before. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the peeling gray walls and rusted bars. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and despair, a miasma that clung to his skin. The murmurs followed him, growing louder as he was marched past rows of cells. "Ain't this something?" One voice called out, laced with disbelief. "Kingston, no way." "No fucking way," another chimed in, sharp and gleeful. "That's the cop who busted up Jerem's ribs. Look at him, no ain't so tough, is he?" The words swirled around him like a storm, each one a reminder of the lives he'd crushed, the bones he'd broken, the pleas he'd ignored. A guarded older man with deep lines etched into his face, and a look of weary indifference took his paperwork from the EA officer. He barely glanced at Kingston, his eyes skimming the page before he muttered, "Get him processed," already turning his attention to the next poor soul in line. Kingston's feet faltered, his body resisting the pull of reality. This couldn't be happening yet to him. But the grip on his arm tightened, shoving him forward, and suddenly he was moving. One reluctant step after another, his muscles screaming to fight, to run, to do anything but surrender to this fate. The cell door creaked open, a rusty wail that set his teeth on edge. "Welcome home," the guard said, a smirk tugging at his lips as he slammed it shut. Kingston exhaled, the air in the cell heavier somehow, the walls pressing in like a vice. He turned, and there was Marcus Lyle again, leaning against the opposite wall. His posture casual, but his presence electric with menace. Well, Lyle drawled, shaking his head as if savoring the moment. "I gotta say, of all the things I thought might happen today, this wasn't one of them." Kingston tensed, his training kicking in assess, de-escalate, control. But how could he control anything now? Shackled and stripped of everything that had once defined him, Lyle stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, a hunter sizing up his catch. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Nah." Of course you don't. I was just another black man to you, just another problem to solve. His expression darkened, the faint amusement draining away, replaced by something raw and jagged. You broke 3 of my ribs, Kingston. Left me in a cell for days, no doctor, no nothing. I almost died. A flicker of defiance sparked in Kingston's chest. He wanted to argue, to say it was justified, that he'd been doing his job, but the words wouldn't come. They festered in his throat, useless and rotting, because for the first time, he had no badge to shield him, no power to bend the truth. Lyle's lips twitched upward, a ghost of a smile, but his eyes were cold, unyielding. "And now look at you," he said, his voice soft but laced with venom. "Ain't karma a beautiful thing?" Kingston swallowed hard, the sour taste of regret coating his tongue. The lesson was clear, etched into the concrete walls and the glinting bars. Justice, when it came, was merciless. He'd spent years abusing his power, believing himself untouchable, above the consequences that snared lesser men. But now, surrounded by the men he'd wronged, their eyes burning with retribution, he saw the truth power could crumble, and when it did, the fall was steep and unforgiving. The bitter taste of defeat lingered on Bradley Kingston's tongue, sharp and unyielding. As he stood there, the weight of Marcus Lyle's words pressing against him like a physical force. "You scared?" Lyle had asked, his voice slipping through the air with a softness that carried an edge of mockery. Though it wasn't cruel, not yet. Kingston forced his head up, his neck stiff with the effort, until his eyes locked with Lyle's. The man's gaze was steady, piercing, and Kingston hated how it made his chest tighten. "No," he said, the word a brittle lie that cracked as it left his lips. Lyle's response was a low, rumbling chuckle, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the cold, concrete walls around them. "Yeah," Lyle drawled, leaning in just enough to let the truth hang heavy between them. "You are." Those words burrowed deep into Kingston's core, settling like stones in his gut, impossible to ignore or shake off. What followed was a whirlwind of hours that blurred into a disorienting fog, a nightmare Kingston couldn't claw his way out of. They stripped him of his crisp, authoritative uniform as a symbol of his dominion and replaced it with a number, a sterile label that erased the man he'd been. His identity, so carefully constructed over years of wielding power, unraveled in the hands of a system he'd once mastered. The officers processing him barely spared him a glance, their faces blank and indifferent, treating him with the same icy detachment he'd perfected. When he stood on the other side of the bars, he'd shuffled men through these same routines, watched them shrink under the weight of their new reality. And now the bitter twist of fate gnawed at him. The irony wasn't just apparent, it was suffocating. When they shoved a phone into his hands for his one call, his fingers trembled, a betrayal of the steady control he'd always prided himself on. He didn't notice the shaking until the first ring pierced the silence, followed by a second. Then a third, each tone stretching his nerves taut. The automated voice broke through. "You have a call from an inmate at Central Holding." A pause, a click, and then her Naomi Carter. Her voice slid through the receiver, smooth and unruffled, devoid of the rage he'd braced himself for. If anything, she sounded faintly bored, and that indifference stung worse than any accusation could have. His grip tightened around the phone, the plastic creaking under his whitening knuckles. "You think this is funny?" he rasped, his throat raw with anger and something perilously close to fear. She sighed, a soft, weary sound, like she was humoring a child. "I think it's poetic," she replied, and the words landed like a slap, igniting a flush of shame across his skin. "I'm getting out of here," he muttered, his voice unsteady, clinging to a shred of defiance. "This won't stick. You know it won't." Silence stretched across the line, thick and oppressive, before Naomi let out a quiet, almost pitying laugh. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her tone dipping into something sharp and cutting. "There's no one coming for you, Bradley. No one's pulling strings. No one's making calls. The people you thought had your back, they're gone. You torched every bridge you ever built." His throat constricted, a lump forming that he couldn't swallow down. "Tell me," she went on, her voice dropping to a near whisper, intimate and merciless. "What does it feel like to realize you staked your entire life on power and fear, and now you're left with nothing?" His heart pounded against his ribcage. a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. "Don't worry," she added, her words dripping with a mocking gentleness. "You'll have plenty of time to figure it out." Before he could muster a response, the line went dead, leaving him clutching the receiver like it was the last tether to his crumbling world. The silence that followed roared in his ears, louder than the chaos he'd once commanded. Naomi's voice echoed in his mind, a relentless specter he couldn't banish. His jaw clenched until his teeth ached, a dull pain radiating through his skull, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The reality of his fall wrapped around him like a noose, tightening with every breath. The power he'd wielded so effortlessly, the fear he'd sown in others, the control he'd worn like a second skin of it had evaporated, leaving him exposed and raw. Naomi had laid it bare with a calm that cut deeper than any shout, and the truth of her words sank into him. He was alone, no favors, no allies, no safety net. The system he'd trusted to shield men like him had turned its back the moment he became a liability. He'd seen it happen before, officers who stumbled, who pushed too far and fell. He'd watched them vanish, their names erased, their lives reduced to hushed warnings swapped over whiskey. Now, he was one of them, another discarded relic. A guard's voice jolted him back to the present, sharp and impatient. "Let's go, Kingston. Processing's done." His legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative, but he forced them to move, each step a grudging surrender. The guard led him down a dimly lit corridor, the air thick with the stench of sweat and despair. Rows of cells flanked the path, their occupants stirring as he passed. Whispers swelled into murmurs, then taunts, the sound rising like a tide. They knew him. His reputation had slithered ahead of him, a shadow he couldn't outrun. Some had felt the brunt of his fists, others had witnessed his cruelty secondhand. And now they relished his dissent. "You ain't so big now, are you, Kingston?" A voice sneered from the gloom. "Where's that tough guy act? Thought you was a badass," another jeered, followed by a chorus of dark, rolling laughter. His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. He'd savored this moment once, watching men crumble as they faced their fate, their eyes wide with dread. He'd led them down these same halls, deaf to their pleas, smirking at their desperation. Now, the tables had turned, and the weight of that justice pressed down on him, unrelenting. The guard stopped abruptly before a cell, gesturing inside with a lazy flick of his hand. "This is you." Kingston stepped in, the door slamming shut behind him with a clang that echoed in his bones. He exhaled sharply through his nose, turning to survey his new prison. The space was suffocating, small, cramped, the air stale and heavy. A thin, stained mattress sagged on a metal cot, flanked by a rusted sink that dripped faintly. The walls bore the scars of those who'd come before, scratched with jagged etchings and faded curses, a testament to forgotten men. It reeked of sweat, of time, of souls left to rot. He'd caged men here his entire career, never once imagining he'd taste the same fate. Now, he understood their desperation, the clawing need to escape. "You'll get your uniform in the morning," the guard said, his tone flat and disinterested, as if Kingston were just another name on a clipboard. "Try not to get yourself killed before then." The warning sent a shiver racing up Kingston's spine, a cold tendril of unease he couldn't shake. He swallowed hard, saying nothing as the guard's footsteps faded down the hall, leaving him alone with the low hum of the prison and the weight of his thoughts. Then, a voice broke the stillness. "So this is real, huh?" Kingston whipped around, his breath catching. Marcus Lyle leaned against the far wall of the cell, arms crossed. His lean frame relaxed, but his eyes glinting with something sharp amusement, maybe, or satisfaction. He hadn't said a word when Kingston was first shoved inside, hadn't joined the others in their taunts. He'd simply watched, biding his time, and now he studied Kingston with a slow, knowing smirk that made the air feel thinner. "But you never thought you'd end up here," Lyle mused, tilting his head as if marveling at the sight. "Not a guy like you. Not Officer Kingston." The title dripped with mockery, and Kingston's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. "Don't start," he growled, the words rough and clipped. Lyle chuckled, a sound that was easy but laced with something darker. "Oh, I'm just making conversation," he said, stepping closer, his presence filling the cramped space. See, I've been thinking about this moment for a long time, dreamed about it even. But I gotta say, even in my wildest dreams, I didn't think it'd feel this sweet. Kingston's nostrils flared as he fought to tamp down the frustration boiling inside him. A hot, restless thing that had nowhere to go. I don't need a lecture, he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Lyle raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Oh, you don't? He took another step, closing the distance until his voice dropped to a low, intense murmur. You remember what you did to me? He asked, his tone deceptively casual. But beneath it ran a current of danger, a quiet fury that had been simmering for years. Or am I just another name you scribbled in a file and forgot about? Kingston didn't answer. Couldn't, his tongue heavy in his mouth. Lyle scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound. That's what I thought. The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken history. And Kingston felt Lyle's gaze boring into him, dissecting him like a hunter sizing up prey. He hated his vulnerability, the loss of every shield he'd ever held. Stripped of his power, he stood naked before the men he'd spent his life breaking. And the lesson burned. Justice, when it came, spared no one. And the consequences of his abuses now towered over him, inescapable. You scared? Lyle asked again, echoing his earlier question, his eyes glinting with quiet triumph. Kingston swallowed, his throat dry, and forced out a no. Lyle's smirk widened. Liar, he said softly, stepping closer still, until the space between them crackled with tension. You ever wonder what it's like? His voice dipped lower, a dangerous whisper now, heavy with intent. Being on the other side, Kingston met his gaze, searching for the old leverage he'd once wielded. But it was gone. Lyle didn't flinch, didn't back down. For the first time, Kingston saw it clearly. The man before him wasn't afraid, not of him. Not anymore. And in that moment, the full weight of his reckoning settled in. A lesson in justice and consequence that would haunt him for every day to come. In the dim, suffocating confines of Central Holding, Bradley Kingston sat with his back pressed hard against the frigid cement wall, the chill seeping through his thin prison garb and into his bones. The smirk that had once danced across Marcus Lyle's face as he regarded Kingston from across the cell had faded, replaced by a steely, unyielding coldness that sent a shiver racing down Kingston's spine. His stomach churned with a sour, gnawing dread as Lyle's words sliced through the stale air like a blade honed by years of resentment. You don't have to wonder anymore, do you? Lyle said, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable dripping with the weight of a truth Kingston could no longer dodge. The realization hit him like a punch to the youth knew exactly what Lyle meant, and it terrified him. Lyle exhaled slowly, a faint tremor in his breath as he shook his head, his eyes never leaving Kingston's face. See, the thing about men like you, he began, his tone measured but laced with a bitter edge, is you strut through life like the rules don't touch you. You break people, shatter them, toss them aced like it's some kind of game, all because you've got that shiny system propping you up. He paused, letting out a dry, mirthless chuckle that echoed faintly off the cell's grimy walls. But now you're in our world. Kingston, out here, that badge you hid behind, it's gone. No one's coming to save you, no backup, no shield, you're just another body in a cage. The words landed like stones, sinking deep into Kingston's core, heavy and inescapable. His breathing slowed to a deliberate rhythm, but his heart thundered in his chest, a wild, frantic drumbeat he couldn't silence. For years, Kingston had wielded power like a god, his every decision a decree that shaped lives with ruthless precision. A flick of his pen could send a man to rot in a cell like this. A swing of his baton could crush his spirit. The slam of a gavel could seal a fate without a second thought. He'd reveled in its control, the authority, the way people shrank under his gaze. But now, stripped of it all, he was nothing. No badge gleamed on his chest. No allies stood at his side. No wall remained between him and the chaos he'd spent his life orchestrating. For the first time, he was powerless, a pawn in a game he'd never learned to play. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. The first night in that cramped cell stretched endlessly before him, a suffocating eternity that pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The space was claustrophobic, its walls seeming to inch closer with every shallow breath he took. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the sour stench of sweat, the musty tang of mildew, and a faint, metallic whisper of old blood spilled in brutal, hushed violence long before he'd ever crossed the threshold. The mattress beneath him was a cruel joke, a threadbare scrap of fabric stretched taut over a slab too hard to be a bed, too yielding to be the floor. He shifted uncomfortably, the coarse surface digging into his skin, but he didn't lie down. Sleep was a luxury he refused to chase, not here, not now. The cell door's iron bars cast jagged, uneven shadows across the cracked cement floor, fractured further by the flickering buzz of a dying fluorescent light overhead. The sound grated on his nerves, a relentless hum like a trapped fly beating its wings against glass. Kingston sat rigid, knees bent slightly, body coiled in a defensive crouch against the wall. Every instinct screamed at him to stay vigilant, to watch the shadows, to brace for the inevitable. He knew what happened to men like him in places like Thisman who'd worn the uniform, who'd swung the stick, who'd written the reports that buried lives. The prison pulsed with its own rhythm, a symphony of creaks, murmurs, and distant shouts that wove into an unspoken code he was only beginning to decipher. Already, he could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into him from the surrounding cells. His arrival had rippled through the block like a stone dropped into still water, disrupting the fragile balance of power. Low voices carried his name through the gloom, a whispered thread woven with curiosity, amusement, and venom. Some inmates watched him with detached interest, others with gleeful anticipation. Their words sharp and taunting. Kingston, they muttered, the name a curse and a promise. He didn't belong here. This wasn't his place. He was meant to stand on the other side of those bars, baton in hand or seated behind a desk, pen poised to condemn. But now he was one of them, a caged animal, vulnerable and exposed, waiting for the jaws of this new world to close around him. Across the cell, Marcus Lyle lounged on the lower bunk, his posture deceptively casual. His arms rested loosely over his knees, but his eyes dark, unreadable, and piercing tracked Kingston's every twitch. Lyle hadn't said much when the guards had shoved Kingston into the cell earlier that evening. He hadn't jeered or thrown a fist like the others might have. He'd simply watched, his silence more unnerving than any taunt. Kingston had felt that gaze like a physical touch, lingering even as the guards' boots faded down the hall, and the prison settled into its restless hum. Now, as the hours dragged on and the weight of his new reality bore down harder, Lyle finally spoke. "But you never thought you'd end up here," he said, his voice a low, even drawl that carried no hint of the fury Kingston had braced for. Kingston didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on a hairline fracture in the cement near the bars, tracing its jagged path as if it held some secret to his survival. He'd spent years mastering the art of control-steering conversations, bending situations, deciding who spoke and who stayed mute. But this wasn't his precinct, where his name carried weight like a weapon. This wasn't a courtroom, where his word could twist truth into whatever shape he desired. This was their domain, and he was a trespasser on borrowed time. Lyle let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if Kingston's silence amused him. "You ain't got nothing to say. That's funny. You always had plenty to say before." Kingston exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing his voice into something steady, something that didn't betray the storm raging inside him. "What do you want me to say?" he muttered, the words rough and reluctant. Lyle's lips twitched, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "I don't know," he replied, leaning forward slightly, elbows braced on his knees. "Maybe start with an apology." The suggestion struck Kingston like a slap, his jaw tightening as pride reared up in defiance. Apologize, to Lyle, to anyone. The idea was absurd, intolerable. Yet beneath that bristling indignation, a darker truth gnawed at him, a quiet, unraveling thread of guilt. He'd locked those cuffs around countless wrists, watched countless eyes dim with despair, and never once looked back. He owed apologies, more than he could name, but they stuck in his throat like shards of glass, refusing to surface. Lyle studied him for a long, unbroken moment, his expression a blank mask. Before he sighed and leaned back, "You ain't ready for that yet," he murmured, almost to himself. Kingston lifted his gaze, something bitter and jagged twisting in his chest. And what? You think you're the one who gets to decide that? Lyle's smirk returned, faint but sharp, his eyes glinting with a knowing edge. You decided a lot of things for a lot of people, didn't you? He countered, tilting his head slightly. Who walked free? Who didn't? Who got to go home to their family? Who got to rot in a hole like this? Ever stop to think what it felt like, sitting there, waiting for some bastard in a uniform to play God with your life, not even seeing you as human? The words cut deeper than Kingston wanted to admit, stirring a sick, twisting ache in his gut. He held Lyle's stare, forcing his face to stay impassive, but the accusation lingered, heavy and undeniable. You think you're different? Lyle pressed, his voice softening into something almost casual, conversational. You think you're special, that you don't belong here? Kingston's breath hitched, a sharp exhale escaping through gritted teeth. I never said that, he snapped. Lyle nodded slowly, unperturbed. But you think it. Silence fell between them, thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant clang of a metal door slamming shut somewhere down the corridor. A voice cursed, raw and furious, another laughed, a dark, guttural sound that sent a chill racing up Kingston's spine. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head, but his muscles stayed taut, ready to spring. Lyle, by contrast, remained unruffled, his body loose and easy, as if he'd been molded by this place, shaped to fit its brutal contours. Maybe that was the real divide between them. Lyle had spent his life knowing the world wouldn't shield him, scrapping for every breath, while Kingston had coasted through his, convinced he was untouchable. Now, that illusion was crumbling, and the lesson was brutal. You look tired, Lyle remarked after a while, leaning back against the wall with a faint smirk. Ain't used to this, huh? Not knowing what's coming, not calling the shots. Kingston shook his head sharply, frustration bleeding into his voice. What do you want from me? He demanded. Lyle shrugged, his tone light, but his eyes piercing. Nothing. Ain't about what I want. It's about what you got left. Kingston frowned, the words sinking in slowly, heavy with implication. What the hell's that supposed to mean? Lyle tilted his head, studying him like a predator sizing up prey. Means you spent your whole life thinking power kept you safe. Now you ain't got it. So what do you got left? The question hung in the air, a quiet detonation that rattled Kingston to his core. He'd built everything: his identity, his confidence, his world and the foundation of authority. Without it, he was adrift, a hollow shell staring down a truth he'd never had to face. Power didn't just protect him, it defined him. And now, with no badge, no allies, no system to lean on, he was forced to confront the consequences of a life spent abusing it. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning. Every choice he'd made, every life he'd broken, had led him here, to this cell, to this moment. And as the night stretched on, merciless and unyielding, he understood that the fall from power wasn't just a punishment, it was a mirror, reflecting the chaos he'd sown. Lyle's gaze never wavered, a silent witness to Kingston's unraveling, and in that unflinching stare, the lesson burned clear. When you wield power without mercy, its loss leaves you defenseless against the world you've shaped. Bradley Kingston stood motionless in the dim, flickering light of the cell block, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had finally crushed the last remnants of his defiance. The man he had once trusted with his career, his reputation, his life, had turned on him with a viciousness that left him reeling. That betrayal had gnawed at him, tearing through his pride until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. For the first time since they dragged him through those rusted iron doors, since the cold reality of his new existence had seeped into his marrow like damp rot, he found himself without a single answer. His mind, once sharp and commanding, churned in chaos, unable to grasp what lay ahead. Lyle, his cellmate, leaned against the chipped edge of the upper bunk, his weary frame casting a shadow that danced across the cracked concrete floor. He watched Kingston with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone, catching the glint of something fragile and unguarded in the man's expression, a fleeting crack in the armor Kingston had worn for years. Lyle didn't prod, didn't dig into that wound. Instead, he gave a slow, knowing nod, as if he'd seen this moment coming from the day they'd been thrown together. Get some sleep, Kingston, he muttered, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual edge. carrying a weight that felt almost like a verdict. "You're gonna need it." With that, he turned away, easing himself onto the lower bunk with a practiced grace, his breathing steadying into the rhythm of rest. Kingston, though, couldn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, eyes wide and unblinking, his pulse hammering against his ribs. For the first time in his life, the future was a void he couldn't navigate. Time inside Central Holdings stretched into an endless, suffocating haze. Days bled into one another, each indistinguishable from the last, marked only by the clang of steel gates and the drone of distant shouts. Kingston, who had once strode through courtrooms and precincts like a king dictating the flow of justice, was now a prisoner to a schedule as unyielding as the stone walls around him. Wake up, eat, be counted, survive. The towering barriers he'd once seen as a shield between himself and the men he'd condemned now loomed over him, holding him captive. The authority that had pulsed through his every word, that had radiated from the crisp lines of his uniform and the swagger in his step, had evaporated. No one flinched at his voice anymore. No one even glanced his way. He was just another faceless figure drowning in a sea of broken men, forgotten by the world beyond. In those early days, Kingston clung to denial like a lifeline. This couldn't be permanent. He told himself, his inner voice fierce and desperate. His appeal would come through. The system he'd served so loyally would recognize its mistake, would pull him back from this abyss. Men like him and who'd worn the badge with pride it didn't belong here. But the weeks dragged on, and the silence from outside grew louder than any prison uproar. No letters arrived. No lawyers stormed in with promises of salvation. The quiet was a chokehold, tightening around his throat until he could barely breathe. It hit him then, a slow, brutal realization. He'd been discarded, left to rot by the very machine he'd spent his life upholding. Survival became his only focus. He moved through the cell block like a ghost, eyes sharp, back pressed against the cold walls, every muscle tensed against the threat of weakness. He ate his meager meals in silence, chewing mechanically as he scanned the room for danger. Sleep came in fits and starts. A few restless hours snatched between the creaks and murmurs of the night. He dodged trouble where he could, keeping his head low, but the whispers trailed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. They grew louder with each passing day, carried on the sneers and sidelong glances of men he'd once locked away. Every inmate had a tale about him, a memory of his fists, his cold laughter, his unrelenting cruelty. They hated him, and he felt it in the air, thick and heavy, a storm brewing just out of reach. Yet no one struck, not yet. They watched him, patient and predatory, circling a wounded animal, waiting for the moment his guard slipped. The first real challenge came on a sweltering afternoon in the yard, where the sun blazed down on cracked pavement, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Men clustered in tight, silent knots, their alliances unspoken but ironclad. Kingston knew the rules: stick to your own, keep your eyes down, blend into the background. But he had no one, no crew, no allies, no shield. He was a solitary figure, exposed and vulnerable. A man without a place in this brutal world. Near the chain-link fence, a group of inmates cut off his path, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the ground. Reggie Torres stepped forward, a hulking figure with a shaved head and knuckles that cracked like gunfire as he flexed them. Kingston's stomach twisted. He knew Torres had arrested him years ago, had left him bruised and bloodied long after the cuffs were on. Torres's dark eyes glinted with recognition, his lips curling into a slow, dangerous smile. "You remember me?" Torres asked, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down Kingston's spine. Kingston stayed silent, his jaw tight, his mind racing for an out that didn't exist. Torres took another step, closing the distance, his grin stretching wider. "I remember you. Beat me senseless when I couldn't fight back. Laughed while I begged you to stop. How's it feel now? Hunt ain't so funny anymore." The other inmates pressed in, their presence a wall of heat and menace, the tension snapping like a live wire. Kingston braced himself, fists clenched, knowing there was no running, no pleading, no mercy to be found. Then Lyle's voice cut through the haze, sharp and steady. "Not today." He stepped into the circle, his lean frame dwarfed by the others but his presence undeniable. Torres scowled, turning his glare on Lyle, What the hell you mean? This bastard deserves everything he's got coming. Lyle didn't waver, his gaze cool and unflinching. Maybe he does, but you jump him now, you'll be the one in solitary, staring at four walls while he's still walking. His karma's already rolling. Let it play out. The words hung there, heavy and deliberate. A long, taut silence followed, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Then Torres clicked his tongue, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a weight. "Guess you're lucky today," he muttered, stepping back. The group melted away, their footsteps fading into the hum of the yard, but their warning lingered like smoke. Kingston exhaled, his breath ragged, his hands still balled into fists as his heart thundered in his chest. He turned to Lyle, confusion warring with the guarded steel in his eyes. "Why?" he rasped, his voice rough and unsteady. Lyle tilted his head, studying him for a moment before answering. "You're not worth dying over," he said simply, then walked away, leaving Kingston standing there, the weight of those words sinking deep into his core. He didn't think Lila couldn't find the words, but something shifted inside him that day. The prison wasn't just a cage anymore. It was a mirror, forcing him to confront the man he'd been. Months passed, each one stripping away another layer of the person he'd once been. The fear he'd inspired, the power he'd wielded, it was gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered vulnerability. In that emptiness, he began to see himself clearly for the first time. The arrogance that had fueled him, the cruelty he'd masked as duty, the lives he'd shattered under the guise of justicity haunted him now, their faces flickering in the dark corners of his cell. Every name on a case file, every plea he'd ignored, every blow he'd delivered weren't just memories. They were pieces of a wreckage he'd built with his own hands, and now he was living in it. One gray morning, a guard summoned him to the warden's office. Kingston trudged down the corridor, his shackles clinking with each step. His mind braced for more bad news, another charge, another reason to keep him buried here. But when he stepped inside, Naomi Carter stood waiting, her arms crossed, her presence as formidable in faded jeans as it had been in a judge's robe. She stood by the window, the dull light casting her silhouette against the glass, her sharp eyes locking onto him as he hesitated by the door. He sank into the chair across from her, his chained hands resting heavily in his lap, and waited. She didn't speak at first, just watched him, her silence pressing against him like a physical force. Finally, she sighed, a sound laced with weariness and resolve. "You've been in here almost a year," she said. Kingston nodded once, his throat tight. "You've had time to think," she went on, her voice steady but probing. "Time to feel what it's like to have no power." He clenched his jaw, the truth of her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. She was right, and he couldn't fight it. She shook her head, exhaling slowly. "This system, it's not made for redemption. But people, sometimes they can change." He swallowed hard, meeting her gaze. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly before she leaned forward. "Your sentence is being reduced. You're going to a rehab program, community service, reintegration, education, outside these walls." Kingston frowned, his mind struggling to process the words. "Why?" he pressed. Naomi's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else, hope, maybe, or expectation. "Because punishment's only worth something if it builds toward better," she said. "Otherwise, it's just revenge dressed up as justice." Her words landed like a punch, stripping away the illusions he'd once clung to. "Don't think this is freedom," she warned, her tone sharp. "You'll work harder than you ever have. You'll be watched, judged, and you'll have to earn your place back in the world." His breath caught, his thoughts spinning. He'd been ready to die in here, had made peace with that fate. But this was a lifeline, a chance he hadn't dared imagine. A year ago, he'd have sneered at it, fought tooth and nail against the idea of bending, of changing. Now, bruised and humbled, he felt the stirrings of something new. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time in months. She held his gaze, searching for sincerity, then nodded. A week later, Kingston stepped out of Central Holding, the sunlight blinding after so long in the gloom. The air tasted different, crisp. Olivia, and he stood there, letting it wash over him. He wasn't the man who'd walked in. chest puffed with pride and power. That man was gone, broken apart by the consequences of his own actions. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a gavel or a sentence, it was a reckoning, a mirror held up to the soul, and in its harsh light, he'd found not just punishment, but the faint, fragile possibility of redemption. The lesson burned deep: power unchecked breeds ruin, and true accountability could either destroy a man or remake him. For Kingston, the choice was his to make. On a crisp late October afternoon, the sun dipped low, casting a warm, amber glow across the sprawling park that Esther Johnson, a 74-year-old woman with a gentle spirit, had come to know as her haven. The sky shimmered with hues of orange and pink, blending into the horizon as if nature itself were painting a farewell to the day. Esther moved with a deliberate slowness, her steps soft against the gravel path, each one a quiet testament to a life rich with experience. The park, nestled like a green jewel amidst the clamor of the city, had long been her refuge, a place where the rustling leaves and distant bird songs drowned out the relentless hum of urban life. To the regulars, she was more than just an elderly woman passing through. She was a fixture, a comforting constant amid the ebb and flow of faces. In her weathered handbag, Esther carried a small collection of treasures: a pair of scratched reading glasses, their frames worn from years of use, a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and filled with her delicate handwriting, and an inhaler, a practical gift from her son Vincent, who never missed a chance to remind her of its importance. "Mom, please, keep it with you," he'd say, his voice a blend of stern care and unwavering love. She smiled faintly at the thought of him as she settled onto her favorite wooden bench, its surface smooth from years of quiet contemplation. Opening her notebook, she traced her fingers over the ink-stained pages, entries that held the weight of her past, memories of her late husband's laughter, and the boundless pride she felt for Vincent, now a police lieutenant. For Esther, this bench was more than a seat. It was a sacred space where she could weave her thoughts into words, preserving fleeting moments before they slipped away forever. The park stretched out before her, a sprawling oasis framed by towering oak trees, their thick branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The air carried the earthy scent of grass, mingling with the faint tang of autumn leaves. Around her, the world moved in gentle rhythm. Families lingered with their children's giggles echoing. Couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers pounded the paths with relentless energy. But as the afternoon waned, the crowds thinned, leaving Esther in the stillness she cherished most. She rested her hand on the notebook, her pen scratching softly as she wrote of Vincent's childhood kindness, how he'd once hauled groceries for their elderly neighbors, how he'd grown into a man who carried justice like a mantle. Her heart swelled with warmth. The cold indifference of the city held at bay by this sanctuary she'd claimed as her own. Unbeknownst to Esther, a pair of eyes lingered on her from across the park, sharp and unwavering. Olivia Brooks, a 27-year-old rookie police officer, stood near a cluster of trees, her uniform crisp and her posture rigid. Fresh from the academy, Olivia was still finding her footing in this unfamiliar beat, her senses heightened by the lessons drilled into her since childhood. Raised by a father who'd served decades on the force, she'd grown up under his ironclad mantra: "Never let your guard down, Olivia. Trouble hides where you least expect it." His voice echoed in her mind now, a constant companion as she scanned the park, her gaze settling on the elderly woman seated alone. Esther's serene demon Northy way she sat so still, her hands occasionally dipping into her bag, stirred something uneasy in Olivia. Was it suspicion, instinct, or simply the pressure to prove herself in a job where every decision carried weight? Olivia's training had taught her to notice the smallest details, to question the ordinary until it revealed its truth. She watched as Esther flipped through her notebook, her movements slow and deliberate, almost too calm for the emptying park. The old woman's hands brushed over the items in her bag: glasses, inhaler, nothing more. Yet to Olivia, each gesture felt cryptic, layered with unspoken intent. She stood at a distance, her breath shallow, wrestling with her own thoughts. Dangerous people don't always look the part, she reminded herself, recalling late-night academy tales of unassuming figures caught in illicit schemes. The weight of her badge pressed against her chest, a reminder of her duty to protect, to act even when doubt gnawed at her. What if this woman was hiding something? What if Olivia's hesitation let a threat slip through her fingers? Meanwhile, Esther remained blissfully unaware of the scrutiny bearing down on her. She paused her writing to glance up, her eyes crinkling with a soft smile as a young couple passed by, their laughter a fleeting melody in the quiet air. Her mind drifted to Vincent Aguinhis' broad shoulders, his steady voice, the way he'd always made her feel safe. The park's tranquility wrapped around her like a blanket, its towering trees standing as silent sentinels. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, a faint unease crept into her chest. She couldn't place it at first, just a flicker, a shadow at the edge of her peace. Then she felt it, the weight of being watched. Her smile faltered, replaced by a tightening in her throat as old memories surface at times when strangers' eyes had lingered too long. Their suspicion rooted not in her actions but in the color of her skin. She brushed the thought aside, clinging to the hope that this was different, that the young officer she glimpsed in the distance was simply doing her job. Across the park, Olivia's internal battle raged on. She shifted her weight, her boots crunching softly against the gravel as she debated her next move. Esther's quiet presence gnawed at her, a puzzle she couldn't solve from afar. Was she overreacting? The woman was elderly, frail even, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote. Yet the bag, the stillness, the solitude, it all felt off, a tableau too perfect to trust. Olivia's father's words looped in her mind, joined now by her instructor's warnings. Details matter. Assumptions kill. She straightened, resolve hardening in her chest. She had to know. With measured steps, she began to close the distance, her pulse quickening as she approached the bench. For Esther, the approach shattered her fragile calm. She looked up, her breath catching as Olivia's figure loomed closer, her uniform stark against the softening light. The officer's expression was unreadably cautious, probing, tinged with something Esther couldn't name. Her heart thudded, a quiet panic rising as she clutched her notebook tighter. This was her park, her sanctuary. Did she suddenly feel like an intruder? She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words tangled in her throat. All she could do was sit, frozen, as Olivia stopped a few feet away, her voice cutting through the silence with a question that carried the weight of accusation. "Ma'am, what are you doing here alone?" Olivia's tone was firm, edged with suspicion she couldn't quite mask. Esther blinked, her hands trembling as she set the notebook aside. I come here every day," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within. "It's where I write, where I think." Olivia's eyes flicked to the bag, then back to Esther's face, searching for a crack in the story. The inhaler sat in plain view now, a mundane detail that should have eased her doubts, but it didn't. Not yet. What neither woman knew in that moment was how their lives were about to collide, bound by a single, irreversible act. Esther's son, Vincent, the lieutenant who lived for justice, would soon learn of this encounter, a spark that would ignite a reckoning neither could escape. Olivia, driven by duty and a flicker of prejudice she didn't fully recognize, would strip away Esther's peace in a way she couldn't foresee. And Esther, caught in the crosshairs of a system she'd trusted through her son, would face a truth she'd never imagined, that power, when wielded carelessly, could unravel everything she held dear. Bradley Kingston's story lingered in the air, a distant echo of this moment. He'd once stood atop the world, untouchable, believing justice was his to bend until it turned on him, stripping away his illusions of control. His fall was a stark lesson. Change was possible, but only when the scales of life tipped, forcing him to confront who he truly was. Esther and Olivia, too, stood at that precipice, their fates intertwined by a fleeting encounter that would ripple outward. Justice, they'd both learn, wasn't about revenge, it was about the raw, unflinching truth that surfaced when power faltered. And in that truth lay the consequences of every choice, every assumption, every abuse of authority, a lesson carved deep into the fabric of their lives, as enduring as the oaks that shaded Esther's beloved park. On a seemingly ordinary evening, the air in the park carried a gentle breeze, rustling the leaves of ancient oaks that stood like silent sentinels. Olivia, a young officer fresh from the academy, paced along the winding gravel path, her polished boots crunching softly against the stones. The fading sunlight painted the world in hues of amber and gold, yet beneath this tranquil facade, A storm brewed within her. She couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her chorea sensation she'd been trained to trust. The academy's lessons replayed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. If something feels off, it likely is. Her instructors had drilled this into her, their voices stern and unwavering, recounting tales of danger lurking beneath the surface of the most innocent moments. But as she scanned the park, her gaze landing on an elderly woman seated on a weathered stone bench, Olivia wrestled with a tangle of doubt. Was she letting prejudice cloud her judgment? Was she unfairly casting suspicion on someone who might simply be enjoying the evening? Her thoughts churned, pulling her in opposite directions. She remembered overhearing colleagues at the precinct swapping stories, cautionary tales of overzealous officers whose excessive wariness sparked unnecessary confrontations. Suspicion, they'd said, could sometimes be a mirage, a trick of an overactive mind shaped by years of training and warnings. Yet her father's voice, steady and commanding, cut through the noise of her uncertainty. A retired officer himself, he'd raised her on stories of vigilance, of duty, of never letting intuition slip through her fingers like sand. The academy had only sharpened that instinct, forging it into a blade she now carried with her everywhere. Torn between dismissing her gut and honoring her training, Olivia's eyes narrowed as she studied the woman Esther more closely. Esther sat with her hands folded atop a worn canvas bag, her posture stiff yet deliberate, as if she were guarding something precious. The elderly woman's silver hair caught the last rays of sunlight, giving her an almost ethereal glow, but her movements betrayed a flicker of unease. She glanced around the park, her eyes darting briefly before settling on the horizon, then snapping back as she sensed Olivia's stare. To Olivia, each subtle gesture way Esther's fingers tightened around the bag. The quick shift of her shoulders felt loaded with meaning, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. Part of her ached to turn away, to leave this woman to her quiet solitude. After all, what harm could an elderly figure pose in a place as peaceful as this? But the weight of her duty pressed down on her, a heavy mantle she couldn't shed. With a slow, deliberate breath, she took a few steps closer, her heart thudding in her chest as the distance between them shrank. Up close, Esther's features came into sharper focus. She sat ramrod straight, her frail frame draped in a faded blue coat that hung loosely over her shoulders. Her hands, etched with the lines of a long life, rested protectively on her bag. But her eyes, dark and deep, betrayed a ripple of discomfort. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked, and Olivia caught a glint of something, fear, perhaps, or wariness that mirrored her own unease. It was enough to solidify the knot in her stomach, enough to convince her that she wasn't alone in feeling the tension that hung between them. Like a taut wire, her mind raced, sifting through memories of academy lessons, scenarios where suspects masked their intentions. Behind harmless exteriors, where hesitation had cost lives, was Esther waiting for someone, hiding something? Olivia couldn't let it go at when every fiber of her being screamed to act. Esther, meanwhile, felt the young officer's piercing stare slice through the calm she'd fought so hard to maintain. The park had long been her sanctuary, a sacred refuge where she came each evening to sit on this very bench, tracing the contours of memories of her late husband's laughter, of the life they'd built together. Now, that piece unraveled under Olivia's unrelenting scrutiny. She tried to brush it off, to tell herself it was nothing, just the idle curiosity of a stranger. But the weight of being watched stirred something darker, memories of times when she'd been judged, cornered, and dismissed for no reason other than the color of her skin. Her chest tightened as frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. She wouldn't let this officer strip away the one place where she still felt whole. Yet when she glanced up and saw Olivia still standing there, her face etched with suspicion, a spark of defiance flared within her. Olivia's internal battle raged on. Her training demanded she act, but a quiet voice whispered that she might be wrong, that she might be letting bias guide her hand. She'd been taught to see threats in shadows, to never let her guard falter. But now that lesson clashed with a gnawing hesitation. Was she unfairly targeting this woman? Still, the pressure of her badge, the echoes of her father's pride, and the academy's rigid expectations drowned out her doubts. With a steadying breath, she made her choice. Her boots scuffed the gravel as she closed the gap, her expression hardening into one of resolve. Esther, sensing the shift, gathered her belongings with trembling hands. The familiar bench no longer a haven, but a stage for an unfolding confrontation. She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and took a few steps away, hoping to escape the officer's gaze. But Olivia wasn't deterred. Her strides quickened, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Esther stopped short, her breath catching as she turned to face the approaching figure. Olivia's voice cut through the stillness, polite yet edged with authority. "Ma'am, I need to check your bag." The words landed like a blow, and Esther's heart sank. Stunned, she searched Olivia's face for a trace of understanding, but found only a wall of determination. Hurt and disbelief welled up inside her, threatening to spill over, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within. "I was just resting here, doing a little writing." Olivia's gaze didn't soften. "I've noticed some suspicious behavior repeatedly rummaging in your bag. For safety, I need to check it." The accusation ignited something in Esther. A wave of frustration crashed over her, dragging up painful echoes of the past moments when she'd been stopped, questioned, and humiliated for no reason at all. This park, her refuge for decades, was supposed to be safe. She'd sat here through countless sunsets, penning letters to her husband in a worn notebook, finding solace in the quiet. Now that sanctity was being torn apart. "I was looking for my inhaler," she said, her tone rising with a mix of anger and desperation. "I have asthma. I need it with me." But Olivia's expression remained unmoved, her mind replaying the mantra of her training. "Don't let anyone fool you. Stay vigilant." She'd heard stories of contraband hidden in plain sight, drugs tucked into mundane objects, and she couldn't risk being the one who let it slip by. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she replied, her voice firm, "but I need to make sure there's nothing dangerous." Esther's patience frayed to its breaking point. "I told you, I'm just looking for my inhaler. I haven't done anything wrong. I have every right to sit here peacefully without being treated like a criminal." Her words were calm, but carried a steel edge, a quiet refusal to bend. Olivia hesitated, a flicker of doubt piercing her resolve, but her training won out. "If you've got nothing to hide, this'll be quick," she said, her tone taut with both authority and a hint of unease. To Olivia, this was more than a routine check. It was a test of her instincts, a chance to prove she could spot danger where others might falter. But to Esther, it was a violation, a wound reopening scars she'd spent years trying to heal. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, her eyes flashing with pain and defiance. "Don't you see how baseless this is? How insulting?" Olivia didn't waver. She'd heard too many tales of threats cloaked in innocence, and she wasn't about to let sympathy cloud her judgment. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," she said, stepping forward and reaching for the bag. Esther instinctively clutched it tighter, her frail hands trembling as she fought to protect it, not just the bag, but the dignity it represented. Her breathing quickened, a mix of fear and fury tightening her chest. "You have no right," she snapped, her voice rising before breaking into a gasp. A sudden shortness of breath seized her, her lungs constricting as panic took hold. She fumbled with the bag, desperate for her inhaler, but her shaking fingers couldn't find it. Olivia, locked in her tunnel of suspicion, misread the scene. Esther's distress only fueled her certainty that something was amiss. "Open your bag," she demanded, her hand outstretched, her tone sharp with urgency. Esther's vision blurred as she struggled to breathe, her voice a faint whisper. "I can't breathe, I need my inhaler." But the words barely reached Olivia, drowned out by the roar of her own convictions. With a swift motion, she pulled the bag from Esther's grasp, causing the elderly woman to stumble backward. Esther's legs buckled, her breath growing shallower, her world tilting as she sank to the ground. Her hand reached weakly for the bag, brushing against the gravel, but her strength ebbed away. Around them, the park seemed to hold its breath. A jogger paused in the distance, his brow furrowing as he watched the scene unfold. A mother pushing a stroller slowed, her eyes widening with concern, but neither moved to intervene. Frozen by the uncertainty of the moment, Esther's fingers clawed at the ground, her chest heaving as she fought for air. The inhaler lay buried in her bag, nestled between a notebook filled with her husband's memory and a pair of reading glasses she'd worn for years. But Olivia, still clutching the bag, rifled through it with mechanical precision, blind to the crisis unfolding before her. In that moment, the weight of justice and the peril of unchecked power collided. Olivia's pursuit of duty, fueled by lessons meant to protect, had spiraled into a force that crushed the innocent. Esther, a woman who'd endured a lifetime of suspicion, now lay helpless, her peace shattered by the very system meant to safeguard it. The lesson hung heavy in the air. Vigilance, when wielded without discernment, could become a weapon, and authority, when blind to humanity, could exact a cost far greater than any threat it sought to prevent. As Esther's breaths faded to whispers, the park grew still, a silent witness to the consequences of a choice made in the name of justice, but at the expense of a life. The air hung heavy with tension as Olivia stood towering over Esther, her stance rigid and unyielding, a fortress of suspicion built from years on the force. Her sharp eyes, narrowed with distrust, traced every flicker of distress on the elderly woman's face, each tremble, each faltering breath only deepening her conviction that something sinister lurked beneath the surface. Esther's frail figure seemed to shrink under the weight of Olivia's scrutiny, her hands clutching her worn handbag as if it were her last lifeline. Inside Olivia's mind, a reel of past cases played on a relentless loop, elderly smugglers with contraband tucked into knitting bags, their innocent facades masking calculated deceit. Those memories fueled her, stoking the fire of her resolve until it blazed with an almost righteous intensity. She wouldn't be fooled, not today. "Ma'am, I need to check your bag, right now," Olivia declared, her voice slicing through the quiet park air like a blade. Gone was any trace of courtesy. Her tone had hardened into something cold and commanding, leaving no room for negotiation. Esther's head tilted upward, her watery eyes meeting Olivia's with a mix of exhaustion and quiet panic. Her voice, fragile and broken by shallow gasps, slipped out in a desperate plea. "I'm just looking for my inhaler. I need it, I can't breathe." The words trembled in the space between them, but they fell on deaf ears. To Olivia, it sounded like the rehearsed excuse of someone cornered, a flimsy shield against the inevitable. Her training had taught her to see through such every stutter. Every plea could be a tactic to evade justice. Esther's growing distress only tightened the knot of certainty in Olivia's gut. This woman was hiding something. Without a flicker of hesitation, Olivia reached forward, her hand darting toward the bag. "I'm sorry, but I'll have to take it," she said, her words clipped and final. Esther's fingers tightened around the straps, a last, feeble attempt to hold on. But her strength was no match for Olivia's determination. The bag slipped from her grasp, and with it, a wave of despair crashed over her. Her chest heaved as she watched helplessly, her breaths growing shallower, her eyes wide with a fear that clawed at her insides. She wasn't just losing a possession, she was losing her ability to breathe, to survive. But Olivia didn't see that. She saw only a suspect, a puzzle to unravel, a threat to neutralize. With the bag in her possession, Olivia wasted no time. She plunged her hands inside, her movements swift and methodical, as if she were defusing a bomb rather than rifling through an old woman's belongings. Out came a tattered notebook, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges, followed by a pair of scratched reading glasses, a small tissue box, and a handful of mundane trinkets, a cane, a faded photograph, a worn coin purse. Each item was ordinary, almost pitifully so. Yet Olivia's conviction didn't waver. She was certain that beneath this veneer of normalcy lay something damning. Her fingers brushed against a small plastic object buried at the bottom, and she pulled it free with a flicker of triumph. Esther's inhaler. She held it up, turning it over in her hands, her eyes narrowing as a flicker of doubt danced across her mind, only to be swiftly extinguished by a flood of suspicion. She'd heard the stories at the academy, hollowed-out pill bottles stuffed with drugs, medical devices turned into Trojan horses for contraband. This could be one of those, she told herself. "What is this?" Olivia demanded, her voice sharp and accusing, as if she'd caught Esther red-handed with a smoking gun. She held the inhaler aloft, inspecting it from every angle, her mind racing with possibilities. Esther, now slumped against a nearby bench, reached out with a trembling hand, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Please, I need to breathe," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rasp of her labored gasps. Her eyes, wide and pleading, locked onto Olivia's, but the officer's focus remained fixed on the inhaler, her suspicions drowning out the human desperation before her. To Olivia, every gesture, every quiver in Esther's frame screamed guilt. She remembered her colleagues' tallow smugglers who'd sobbed and begged, only to be found with stashes hidden in plain sight. For safety reasons, I'll need to hold onto this for further inspection, she announced, slipping the inhaler into her pocket with a decisiveness that brooked no argument. Esther's world tilted. The loss of her inhaler wasn't just a theft, it was a death sentence creeping closer. With every shallow breath, her chest tightened, her heart hammering against her ribs as if desperate to escape. Her vision blurred, the park's green expanse fading into a hazy smear of color. She stretched her hands toward Olivia, a silent, fading plea, but her legs buckled beneath her. With a soft thud, she crumpled to the ground, her fingers still outstretched, grasping at air. Only then did Olivia pause, her certainty fracturing as she stared at the motionless figure sprawled before her. The elderly woman's chest barely rose, her lips parted in a soundless cry. Shock rooted Olivia to the spot, her breath catching as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Around them, the park stirred to life. A handful of passers-by slowed their steps, their murmurs rising like a tide. Eyes turned toward Olivia, sharp with judgment, their whispers weaving a web of condemnation. In an instant, the narrative shifted. She wasn't the protector she'd imagined herself to be, Besh was the aggressor, the one who'd brought an old woman to the brink. Guilt surged through her, cold and suffocating, as she fumbled in her pocket for the inhaler. Kneeling beside Esther, she pressed it into her limp hand, her own fingers trembling. "Here, take it," she muttered, her voice cracking with urgency. But Esther's grip was too weak to hold it. The crowd thickened, their stares boring into Olivia like needles. Some pulled out phones, dialing for help, their voices tinged with urgency and outrage. Every second stretched into an eternity, each one a silent accusation that echoed in Olivia's skull. Amid the growing chaos, a figure pushed through the onlookers, his strides quick and purposeful. Vincent Johnson, a police lieutenant with a reputation for calm under pressure, had been winding down his day with his usual ritual, a stop at the park to pick up his mother, Esther, and take her home. The sight of the crowd near her favorite bench sent a jolt of unease through him, a primal instinct whispering that something was terribly wrong. His heart thudded louder with each step, and when he broke through the ring of bystanders, the world seemed to stop. There she was, his mother crumpled on the ground, her face ashen, her breaths faint and ragged. "Mom," he cried, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands grasping her shoulders with a tenderness born of fear. "Can you hear me? I'm here. You're going to be okay." Esther's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, a spark of recognition lighting their depths. Her cold, fragile hand found his, and she clung to it as if it were her anchor in a storm. Vincent's gaze swept over her, then landed on Olivia, who stood frozen, the inhaler still dangling from her hand. Her face was a mask of regret, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of her mistake. Vincent's jaw tightened as he pieced it together, the inhaler, his mother's collapse, Olivia's rigid posture. "That's my mother's inhaler," he said, his voice low and taut with barely contained fury. "What were you doing with it?" Olivia opened her mouth, but no words came, only a stammered breath, a feeble attempt to justify the unjustifiable. In that moment, her carefully constructed fortress of certainty crumbled, leaving her exposed and raw. Vincent snatched the inhaler from her grasp, his movements swift but gentle as he turned back to Esther. He pressed it to her lips, guiding her through each labored breath. "Come on, Mom, just breathe," he murmured, his voice a lifeline in the haze of her panic. Slowly, agonizingly, her gasps steadied, her chest rising with a rhythm that promised life. Color crept back into her cheeks, faint but real, and Vincent exhaled a shaky breath of relief. Yet the anger simmering within him didn't fade. He rose to his feet, towering over Olivia, his eyes blazing with a mix of grief and reproach. "Do you realize what you've done?" he demanded, each word a hammer striking stone. "My mother, 74 years old, sitting quietly in the park, almost didn't make it because of you, because of your reckless assumptions." Olivia shrank under his gaze, her head bowing as shame swallowed her whole. She'd let suspicion cloud her judgment, let bias twist her instincts, until she'd ignored the obvious, a woman in need, not a criminal in disguise. I didn't mean she started, but the words died in her throat, hollow and inadequate. Vincent's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding. What were you thinking? Taking an elderly woman's inhaler while she begged to breathe. She's not a threat, she's my mother. And you treated her like a suspect. His words weren't just an accusation, they were a mirror, reflecting the depth of her failure. She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't face the truth staring back at her. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their judgment a chorus that drowned out any defense Olivia might have mustered. Vincent turned away from her, his focus returning to Esther as he helped her sit up, his hands steadying her trembling frame. "You're a police officer," he said over his shoulder, his tone heavy with disillusionment. "Your job is to protect, to serve, and not to terrorize innocent people with baseless suspicion. Your prejudice nearly killed her." The weight of his words settled over Olivia like a shroud, stripping away the pride she'd once worn like armor. She stood there, hollowed out by remorse, watching as Vincent cradled his mother, whispering reassurances while the park buzzed with the aftermath of her mistake. In that moment, the lesson carved itself into Olivia's soul. Justice wasn't a blunt instrument to wield with unchecked power. It demanded discernment, compassion, a willingness to see beyond the surface. Her abuse of authority had nearly stolen a life, fractured a trust she was meant to uphold. As the distant wail of an ambulance pierced the air, she knew this wasn't just a mistake, it was a reckoning. For Esther, for Vincent, for the community she'd failed, and for herself. There was no undoing the damage. Only the hard, humbling road of accountability lay ahead, a path she'd have to walk with the echoes of this day ringing in her ears. Olivia stood rooted to the spot, her throat tightening as she swallowed hard, a bitter taste of shame lingering on her tongue. Her eyes stung, turning a raw, aching red, not from tears just yet, but from the crushing weight of guilt that pressed against her chest. She wasn't just staring at a fleeting personal misstep. This was something far bigger, a jagged, unmissable lesson about duty, fairness, and the fragile threads that hold a community together. She hadn't fully understood it before, but now it loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. "I am so sorry, Lieutenant Johnson," she stammered, her voice quivering like a fragile leaf caught in a storm. The words spilled out, shaky and drenched in remorse, barely audible over the thudding of her own heart. "I messed up badly. I never meant for it to spiral out of control like this." Her hands fidgeted in front of her, fingers twisting together as if they could somehow wring out the regret that consumed her. Vincent didn't respond right away. His silence stretched across the space between them, heavy and deliberate, like the calm before a judge's verdict. He stood there, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading afternoon light, his dark eyes locked on her. For a few agonizing seconds, he said nothing, just watched her with a gaze that pierced through her defenses. Then, with a slow, almost tender movement, he bent down to his mother Esther, who sat crumpled on the ground, her frail hands trembling from the ordeal. Vincent's strong arms slid around her, lifting her gently to her feet. He held her close, his touch protective yet soft, as if shielding her from the world that had just turned against her. Step by careful step, he guided her through the sea of onlookers, neighbors, strangers, all whispering and staring, leading her away from the chaos Olivia had unleashed. But before they disappeared into the crowd, Vincent paused. He turned his head, just enough to cast one final look back at Olivia. That single glance carried a weight she couldn't bear, disappointment so deep. It felt like a physical blow. His eyes, usually steady and commanding, were now clouded with a quiet, unspoken betrayal that cut her to her core. Her chest tightened, her heart squeezed in a vice of her own making. She knew then that earning back his trust and the trust of the people she'd sworn to protect might be a mountain too steep to climb, a wound too deep to heal. As Vincent and Esther's figures faded into the throng, Olivia remained frozen, alone in the center of the judgmental storm. The crowd's eyes bore into her like needles, their murmurs a low hum of accusation. She felt trapped, caged by her own shame, guilt clawing at her insides like a living thing. What had just happened wasn't a fleeting mistake, it was a scar, a raw and jagged mark etched into her soul. It was a brutal reminder of the compassion she'd failed to show, the responsibility she'd shirked, and the prejudice she'd let fester unchecked. Overwhelmed, she watched the last glimpse of Vincent and his mother vanish, their departure a silent condemnation. Every time she replayed this moment in her mind, and she knew she would, over and over it would sting anew, a relentless echo of the pain she'd inflicted on an innocent family. The next morning dawned cold and gray, mirroring the dread that coiled in Olivia's stomach. A summons had arrived, ordering her to Vincent's office at the police station. As she trudged down the long, sterile corridor, each step felt like wading through mud, her boots dragging against the polished floor. The station was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant clatter of a phone ringing. Unanswered, every sound seemed amplified, bouncing off the walls to mock her, a constant reminder of the colossal error she'd made. Her palms were slick with sweat, her breath shallow as anxiety gnawed at her resolve. She couldn't escape this reckoning, nor did she deserve to. When she reached Vincent's door, it creaked open with a slow, ominous groan, and she stepped inside. Her head bowed, unable to meet his gaze. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the air thick with tension. Vincent sat behind his desk, his broad shoulders squared, his face a mask of stern resolve. The warmth she'd once seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hardness that made her stomach twist. Disappointment radiated from him, palpable and suffocating, and she felt it settle over her like a second skin. "Take a seat, Officer Brooks," he said, his voice low and clipped, each syllable sharp as a blade. There was no room for softness here, no trace of the camaraderie they'd once shared. Olivia obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to still their trembling. She braced herself, knowing this confrontation was inevitable, a storm she'd brought upon herself. Vincent's eyes bore into her, unyielding, and the silence that followed was a heavy, suffocating thing. After what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk. "I think you know why you're here today, don't you?" His tone was measured, but beneath it simmered a current of restrained emotion. Olivia nodded, a small, jerky movement, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes, Lieutenant," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "To understand." He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he fought to keep his composure. The pain was there, etched into the lines of his face, though he masked it with professionalism. "Good. Then I want you to tell me everything in detail, from start to finish, about what happened with my mother yesterday. I need to hear it from you." Her throat felt like sandpaper as she swallowed again, forcing the words past the lump of regret lodged there. "To saw your mother sitting alone in the park," she began, her voice faltering but pressing on. "She was just there, on the bench, and I don't know why, but something about it set me on edge. She was digging through her bag, and to let myself assume the worst, my suspicions took over, and I didn't stop to think. Every word tasted bitter, a confession of her failure laid bare." Vincent's jaw tightened, but his voice remained eerily calm, each question a precise strike. "So, just because an elderly woman was sitting by herself in a park, rummaging through her own bag, you decided she was suspicious?" Olivia lifted her head, meeting his gaze for the first time, and the ice in his eyes sent a shiver through her. Shame crashed over her like a tidal wave, drowning her in its depths. "I was wrong, Lieutenant," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I let prejudice cloud my judgmentification, fear, whatever you want to call it. I thought I was doing my job, protecting people, but I was irrational. I see that now." He didn't flinch, his stare unwavering, cutting deeper with every second. "You thought confiscating an elderly woman's inhaler while she was gasping for air was protecting the community, Officer Brooks." His words were a quiet thunder, reverberating with controlled fury. Her head dropped again, the weight of his accusation pressing her down until she felt small, insignificant. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "I was wrong. I didn't think about her health, her needs. I was so caught up in my own assumptions that I missed what was right in front of me." Vincent let the silence stretch again, his gaze a mix of frost and fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft but searing. "Do you know what cuts me deepest, Olivia? It's that you treated my Mothra innocent. vulnerable woman like she was some kind of threat. You let bias steer you, and you stripped her of her dignity without a second thought. His words sliced through her, sharp and unforgiving, and she had no defense to offer. She'd failed not just as an officer, but as a person. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her remorse. "I have no excuse. I know I can't undo what I did, but I swear I regret it with everything I am." Vincent watched her, letting her words hang in the air, their inadequacy echoing between them. "Do you think an apology fixes this, Officer Brooks?" he asked, his tone a challenge she couldn't meet. She raised her eyes, red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears. "No, I know it doesn't," she replied, her voice steadier now, fueled by a flicker of resolve. "But I'm ready to face the consequences. I want a chance to make this right however I can." He sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion, and for the first time, a hint of softness crept into his expression though his resolve remained ironclad. "Olivia, you've shattered my trust, and worse, the trust of the people we serve. Every move you make reflects on this department, on the badge you wear. We're here to protect, to uphold fairness, not to wield power carelessly." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "You'll undergo intensive training because recognition, conflict management, the works. This isn't a slap on the wrist, it's a deep dive into understanding your role. And you'll serve the community directly face to face so you can learn what it truly means to protect and respect the people here." Olivia's breath caught, a mix of relief and trepidation washing over her. It was a lifeline, a chance to claw her way back from the abyss she'd fallen into. The path ahead would be grueling, but she welcomed it. "I understand, Lieutenant," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "I'll follow every step you've laid out. I won't let you down again." Vincent studied her, his sternness softening just enough to reveal a glimmer of hope. "I hope you've learned something from this, Olivia. You hurt my mother. You damaged the faith people had in you. Don't forget compassion and justice are the backbone of this job. Prejudice has no place here." She nodded, her eyes still red but resolute. "I get it, sir. I'll carry this lesson with me always." He held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. "You can go, Officer Brooks. Start walking that road to redemption now." She rose, offering a respectful bow, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll do everything I can." As she stepped out of the office, the weight on her shoulders didn't vanish, but it shifted lighter. Somehow, with purpose. The journey ahead stretched long and daunting, a steep climb to reclaim what she'd lost. But she vowed then and there to emerge from this a better officer, a better human soul who understood the sacred duty to safeguard her community with empathy and equity. Weeks later, Olivia threw herself into the bias and conflict management program, her days filled with grueling sessions that peeled back layers she hadn't known existed. The classroom was a stark, fluorescent-lit space, its walls lined with posters about duty and integrity-ironic reminders of what she'd failed to uphold. Each lecture forced her to confront the shadows within herself, the snap judgments and unchecked fears that had led her astray. Practical exercises pushed her further, role-playing scenarios, where she had to navigate tense encounters, her every decision dissected by instructors who offered no leniency. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but with each passing day, she began to see the world through clearer eyes. The group discussions hit hardest. Sitting in a circle with fellow officers, she listened as voices some shaky, some defiantured stories of prejudice they'd seen or sown. One afternoon, a local resident joined them, a weary man with tired eyes and a voice rough with emotion. He spoke of being stopped by police, his every move questioned, his dignity stripped away for no reason beyond the color of his skin. "It's like you're invisible until they decide you're a problem," he said, his words trembling with quiet rage. "Then you're nothing but a target." Olivia's heart thudded as he spoke, each sentence a mirror reflecting Esther's fear, her own mother's humiliation. She saw herself in his story net as the victim, but as the hand that had tightened the noose of suspicion. The realization burned, but it fueled her. She wouldn't just atone, she'd dismantle the instincts that had betrayed her, brick by brick, until justice, not power, guided her every step. Olivia stood in the bustling heart of the local community center, her police uniform crisp yet slightly uncomfortable against her skin, as if it still didn't quite fit the person she was becoming. She had always believed her role as an officer was straightforward: Denton order, enforce rules, keep the peace. But as she moved through the crowd of residents, their voices a symphony of laughter, frustration, and hope, she felt a shift deep within her. Duty, she realized, wasn't just about control. It was about safeguarding something far more fragile: the rights, the dignity, the very safety of every soul in the neighborhood she'd sworn to serve. This wasn't a lesson learned in the sterile halls of the police academy. It was one carved into her through the raw, unfiltered humanity she encountered here. The community activities she'd been assigned to weren't optional, they were a mandate, a bridge between her badge and the people it was meant to protect. At first, she'd approach them with a guarded heart, unsure of what to expect. The center itself was a weathered building, its walls chipped and faded, yet alive with the energy of those who gathered there. Children darted between tables, their giggles echoing off the ceiling, while adults swapped stories over cups of lukewarm coffee. Olivia's eyes scanned the room, catching glimpses of faces she might have passed by 100 times before, faces she'd never truly seen. She felt a pang of unease, a quiet admission that she'd carried biases she hadn't even recognized until now. Working beside these people, hearing the cadence of their lives, their struggles, their dreams, their quiet resilience stirred something in her she couldn't ignore. One humid afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the center's dusty windows, Olivia met Mrs. Harris. The older woman sat at a folding table, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded atop a worn paperback novel. She was a retired teacher, a fixture in the neighborhood for decades, her presence as steady as the oak trees lining the streets. Mrs. Harris's voice was soft but firm as she recounted a memory that made Olivia's stomach twist. Years ago, while shopping late one evening, she'd been trailed by a police officer, her every move scrutinized simply because of the color of her skin. The sting of humiliation had lingered, she said, her eyes distant yet piercing. "It was the first time I felt like a stranger in my own home," she murmured, her words heavy with a sorrow that had settled into her bones. Olivia listened, her chest tightening as she pictured the scene: Mrs. Harris, clutching her grocery bags, her steps quickening under the weight of an undeserved suspicion. For Olivia, it conjured another memory: helpless, hollow look in Esther's eyes that day in the park, a moment that had shaken her awake. She saw now how a single careless act, a fleeting assumption, could ripple outward, leaving scars that festered beneath the surface. Justice, she thought, wasn't just about punishment, it was about seeing people, truly seeing them, and bearing the consequences when you failed to. The community center wasn't just a place for reflection, it was a crucible. Olivia found herself drawn into conversations with a group of teenagers who lingered near the edges of the room, their hoodies pulled low, their eyes flickering with distrust. To them, she was a uniform, a symbol of a system they'd learned to brace against. Their initial exchanges were stilted, punctuated by long silences and sidelong glances. Olivia didn't push, she sat with them, her posture relaxed, her voice steady as she shared pieces of herself, her rookie mistakes, her doubts, her determination to do better. Slowly, the ice cracked. One boy, Marcus, lingered after the others drifted away. He was lanky, his frame still catching up to his ambitions, his dark eyes sharp with a mix of defiance and longing. "I want to be a cop," he confessed one day, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared. Scared they'll look at me and see a suspect, not a shield." His words hit Olivia like a punch. Felt that same fear once, that same hunger to prove herself. She saw her younger self in him, raw and untested, and knew her actions now would shape the path he'd walk. Power, she realized, could crush dreams as easily as it could nurture them. Then there was the mural. On a brisk Saturday, Olivia joined the teens, Marcus among them in front of a cracked concrete wall at the center. Paint cans clattered against the pavement, their metallic tang mixing with the scent of fresh grass. The group had decided on a design, a vibrant tapestry of hands clasped together, faces of every shade smiling beneath a sky streaked with gold. Olivia dipped her brush into a can of blue, her strokes tentative at first, then bolder as laughter bubbled up around her. Marcus painted beside her, his focus intense, as if each line he drew was a step toward the future he craved. The mural grew under their hands, a testament to unity, respect, a fragile hope that prejudice could be painted over with something brighter. As Olivia stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow, she felt a quiet renewal stirring within her, a shedding of the arrogance that had once blinded her, replaced by a vow to serve with eyes wide open. In the distance, she spotted Esther. The woman stood alone, her coat pulled tight against the wind, her gaze fixed on the mural. Olivia's heart thudded as she set down her brush and crossed the patchy lawn. Esther's face, once etched with hurt, softened as Olivia approached. "Hello, Mrs. Esther," Olivia said, her voice trembling with reverence. She dipped her head, a small gesture freighted with meaning. "I'm so sorry for everything." Esther's silence stretched, heavy with the weight of memory. Before she spoke, "You hurt me, Olivia," she said, her tone gentle yet unyielding, "but I see you're trying." Her eyes held no malice, only a quiet strength that demanded accountability. Olivia felt the sting of it. Forgiveness wasn't a gift handed over lightly. It was a road paved with effort and remorse. They stood together, the mural's colors dancing in the afternoon light, and Olivia vowed to earn that trust, step by painstaking step. Justice wasn't instant, it was a journey, and she'd walk it. Months rolled by, each day a thread in the tapestry of Olivia's transformation. The community center became her proving ground, its lessons sinking deeper into her marrow. She returned to the park one crisp autumn day, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. A new project had begun, a second mural, this time on a sprawling wall where joggers and dog walkers passed daily. Officers, residents, and teens mingled, their chatter rising over the rustle of paintbrushes. Marcus was there, his shoulders squared, his brush moving with purpose. "I believe we can change things," he told her, his voice steady, his eyes alight with a fire she hadn't seen before. "You showed me it's not just a job, it's about all of us." Olivia's chest swelled with pride, a flicker of relief that her stumbles hadn't dimmed his spark. Together they painted scenes of harmony, elders swapping stories, kids chasing dreams, uniforms standing shoulder to shoulder with neighbors woven into a vision of peace. As the sun dipped low, casting amber streaks across the park, Olivia caught sight of Esther again. The woman stood at the edge of the grass, her silhouette framed against the horizon, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Olivia approached, her steps deliberate, her breath catching as she met Esther's gaze. "Thank you for being here, Mrs. Esther," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. Esther's eyes, deep and knowing, held hers. "You've come far, Olivia," she replied. "I feel it, your change." The words wrapped around Olivia like a balm, soothing the ache of her past missteps. "You taught me what I should have known all along," she said. "You gave me a chance to fix this, and I won't forget it." Esther's smile widened, warm and unguarded. "We all falter," she said. "What counts is owning it, making it right. You've done that for me, for all of us." Before turning away, Esther added softly, "Your job's more than order, it's trust. We're counting on you, Olivia. Don't lose that." Their eyes locked, a silent pact sealed in the fading light. And then Esther drifted off, her steps slow but sure. Olivia watched her go, a swell of resolve anchoring her to this moment. This wasn't an end, it was a charge, a promise to carry forward. As dusk settled over the park, she rejoined the group, her hands steady as she added final touches to the mural. It gleamed in the twilight, a radiant emblem of forgiveness, of unity, of the woman she'd become. The bright huskrimson, gold, indigested as a vow every person here deserved to be seen, heard, shielded, no matter their story. From a distance, Esther glanced back, her expression soft with hope. She saw more than a mural, saw a community stitching itself back together, thread by fragile thread. Olivia had changed, yes, but so had they all, stepping out of shadows into something stronger. The mural wasn't just art, it was a heartbeat, pulsing with compassion, with the weight of accountability, with the quiet power of coming together. Through Esther, Olivia, and every hand that held a brush, the story whispered a truth. Prejudice splits us apart, but understanding knits us whole. Justice isn't a gavel strike, it's a life lived with care. A trust rebuilt one earnest act at a time. And in that promise, Olivia found her calling, to be an officer not of force, but of fairness, guarding the fragile, beautiful trust of the people she served.